Let's do this. If you're at all aware of pop culture today, you really don't need me to tell you how big Marvel movies have become. I mean, they're basically almost impossible to avoid, even if you don't like them. And it's been that way for most of the MCU's existence. From Iron Man to Endgame, the MCU movies have been on a pretty straight trajectory upwards, with some small bumps in the road, or bigger ones depending on how you feel about the recent phases. But still, until recently, the MCU's success and continued prevalence in pop culture has never really been in question. Their TV shows, on the other hand, that journey has been a lot more rocky, pretty much exemplified by the messy history of the MCU's first live-action TV show, Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. After The Avengers was released in 2012, breaking box office records and shattering expectations, proving that an ensemble superhero film could not only work but be a huge success, expansion was a no-brainer for Marvel Studios. They made it on the big screen, so why not the small screen? And since Marvel TV's launch in 2010, they'd been searching for the perfect show to make that transition. Several projects were tossed around, including a Hulk show directed by Guillermo del Toro and a Jessica Jones show, which would later be produced by Netflix, but at the time, ABC rejected both concepts for being too dark, and the head of Marvel TV, Jeff Loeb, was told that he couldn't shop around these ideas to other channels because he had to feed the mothership, ABC, first.
Disney owns both, and Disney didn't want to have their best show on another network.
But the summer after The Avengers was released, Loeb finally landed on an idea that would get ABC to bite. A show focused on none other than Marvel's spy organization, S.H.I.E.L.D., which we first saw on screen in Iron Man, introduced by fan-favorite character
Agent Phil Coulson with the Strategic Homeland Intervention Enforcement and Logistics Division.
That's quite a mouthful.
I know. We're working on it.
The pitch was pretty strong. It would be the first of its kind, set in the Marvel Universe and tied to the movies, but with a story that would stand on its own. And best of all, once greenlit, the pilot would be written and directed by none other than Marvel Golden Boy, Joss Whedon.
They said, you need to bring us something which is undeniable. That was the word that they kept saying. And so I went to Dan and said, I have something that's undeniable.
Wow.
And
cool.
and he said, what's that? And I said, Joss.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. We know now that Joss Whedon sucks, but that was not the sentiment at the time. In fact, it was basically the complete opposite. He was already well loved in nerd communities for his shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly, and his work on the Avengers just kind of cemented his nerd god status. So a show like S.H.I.E.L.D. seemed like the perfect marriage of his past TV work and his current Marvel movie work. I'm going to be talking about Whedon a bit in this video, and I don't want to breeze past the shitty things he's allegedly done. But I can't really cover them in detail because it's just kind of out of the scope of what this video specifically is talking about. If you want to know details, I would really encourage you to check out the things that I've linked in the description below. So, with the pilot officially greenlit, Joss Whedon and his co-creators for the show, his brother Jed Whedon and Marissa Tancharoen, who had also worked with him on several of his previous projects, launched into the development process. Jed Whedon and Marissa Tancharoen are also married, by the way. I couldn't really find a way to fit that in here without making it sound like I was minimizing icon Marissa Tancharoen to just being Jed's wife, but I think that's an important and interesting detail, so here it is. From there, they hammered out the rest of the concept of the show, its focus, its characters, and that it would mainly be about the human side of a superhuman universe.
For me, the idea behind it is really embodied by Clark. It was the idea of the guy in the superhero story who doesn't have any superhero powers. the guy who's next to the big action, who's affected by it, in some cases very damagingly.
And Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was born. Coming off the high of the Avengers, fan expectations were high. And granted, the show seemed to have everything going for it. A big studio that at the time could basically do no wrong, and a director who was, also at the time, adored for his previous projects. It seemed like the perfect recipe for success. So, what happened? Why does today's Marvel Studios basically act like this show never existed? Well, it's complicated. What did you expect me to say? You clicked on this video. You saw the time code. You did see the time code, right? You know what you're getting into? That bit was not worth wearing these for so long. But that's what I'm going to be diving into in this video, as well as the two others that'll hopefully, maybe, probably be coming out within the next couple of months. A comprehensive, or at least as comprehensive as I could manage, history and exploration of the show's tumultuous existence and then near abandonment by the studio that created it, all from the perspective of someone who holds the show very near and dear to her heart, despite its messiness. I had the chance to follow it from the beginning. Luckily, my family got into Marvel with the Avengers, so we got on the boat just before it started airing. And I pretty much immediately fell in love with it. The story, the characters, everything really. And just like that, it became a not insignificant part of my life for the next 7 years and beyond that, really. And I just think that this show and everyone who's worked on it, the cast, the crew, anyone who's had a hand in it, deserves so much more appreciation than they get for creating something that's so meaningful to me and I know many others. So I'm just trying to do my own piece of that. So yeah, grab a snack or an 8-course meal and enjoy. The real beginnings of S.H.I.E.L.D. aren't in season 1 or in whatever writer's room the show is conceptualized in. For that, we have to go all the way back to 2008 when a little character named Phil Coulson was introduced in the first Marvel movie, Iron Man. He was mostly there just to introduce S.H.I.E.L.D. and lead into the Avengers Initiative tease, but despite having less than 5 minutes of screen time, Clark Gregg's performance clearly stood out enough to earn him a spot in more future movies and one-shots, the shorts that covered ground between those movies. He pretty quickly skyrocketed his way into being a fan favorite, mostly because even though he worked for the big mysterious spy organization constantly coming up against alien and superhuman threats, he was kind of just a normal guy. Just a chill dude. Like, you could totally hang out with this guy. And I think that made him relatable for a lot of people.
I've been a Phil Coulson fan since, like, he appeared in Iron Man, basically. Like, that was, like, the first, like, oh, I always gravitate towards the background characters and, like, the people in the background that have to manage all the wackiness and, like, keep everything together. I always gravitate towards those characters. And then Clark Gregg is so charismatic in that role right from the beginning. So that kind of drew me to this character immediately. And then the connectivity of seeing that character pop up from, like, every movie forward, I was like, oh, that's really cool.
His role in the Avengers only expanded on that by making him a Captain America fanboy. Look, he has a trading card collection. Look how excited he is to meet Cap. He's just like us.
I sort of met you. I mean, I watched you while you were sleeping. I mean, I was present while you were unconscious. from the ice.
And honestly, this was the perfect role for Greg, who was a pretty major Marvel nerd himself.
He's a major fanboy. He grew up reading Captain America comics, and I so related to that. That's how I felt when I met different people in the Marvel universe. It really connected the dots for me.
And all of this created a whole fandom around the character. People loved him. I mean, how can you not? Come on, look at him. Look at him. Unfortunately, the same movie that would give him a bigger role and expand on his character also killed him. Rest in peace, Coulson. And while it is common for some random side character to create a fan base around them, what's not always common is for that character's death to spark a movement. Coulson Lives became an entire campaign, a hashtag, merch, an entire ARG, a freaking parade.
I was one of those people that, like, I printed out this, like, have you seen this man? If found, please report to, like, Agent Fury, like, things, and I put it up at work, and then there were always like so many people, like, at that time analyzing the movie and like, oh well, he didn't get stabbed in a way that would have killed him, but Fury could have resurrected him. Here's my fic explaining in 5,000 words, and, like, everything, and I ate it all up and I devoured it, and I, like, you would have had like the conspiracy board on the background with the red strings repeat like, he's fine. The movie didn't happen the way we all saw it, and he's fine.
It was so loud that even Marvel couldn't ignore it. In fact, talk about the movement would even seep its way into talks for a potential S.H.I.E.L.D. focused show that summer. Like I mentioned, at this point, the show got picked up, the pilot was greenlit, but at this point, no one really knew all that much about it other than that it was the Whedon S.H.I.E.L.D. show. That is, until New York City Comic Con that fall, where, for some fans, the biggest news of all would drop.
What I said was, Coulson lives.
At the con's Marvel TV panel, Greg ended up dropping in, and fans there were treated to a Coulson tribute, which apparently nearly brought him to tears. There was also a shout out to some of the popular fan theories at the time of how Coulson could still be alive, one being that he could become the Vision, and another, ironically, being that maybe he was an LMD and didn't die after all. But then, a video of Joss Whedon interrupted the whole thing. According to a Tumblr post that Paige wrote, there was this whole bit where Whedon began to talk about how they love Coulson, but they can't bring him back because it would be universe breaking. Then Kevin Feige slides in with a Coulson Lives shirt, and Whedon changes his tune. They announced that Coulson was always going to be the one headlining a S.H.I.E.L.D. show. The crowd went absolutely wild at this whole thing. Not only was Coulson coming back, he was getting his own show.
And then I remember, like, the crowd and the clapping and the room being so electric and being so amazed that this weird fan movement actually kind of, like, I wouldn't say did something, but definitely had a cool impact. I remember after the panel just getting out and, like, literally just running down the really long hallway in the Javits going, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Having, like, so much energy that I didn't know where to put.
Fans undeniably played a huge part in the inception of the show. I really doubt that Marvel would have banked an entire show on a pretty minor character if there hadn't have been such a vocal fan base behind him. And in the process, those fans basically changed the course of Marvel history and made this show exist. And I think that's a feat that just deserves appreciation. By this time, the trio of Whedon, and Tancharoen had most of the beginning of the show mapped out, having co-written the pilot alongside executive producers Jeff Loeb and Jeff Bell. And they were ready to begin production in January 2013. But, of course, they needed a cast first. Casting for the rest of the show took place in fall, giving some actors only a couple of months to prepare before filming would begin. Alongside Greg, the show would star Ming-Na Wen as Melinda May, Brett Dalton as Grant Ward, Ian DeCasticker as Leo Fitz, Elizabeth Henstridge as Gemma Simmons, and Chloe Bennett as Skye. And once January rolled around, production began. The budget for the show was at least decently high for shows at the time. High enough for convincing special effects and on-location shoots in places like Paris, even though the show would only be there for like 10 minutes, if that. That didn't last long, though, due to logistics issues. The entire time, expectations from fans who were used to these big, grand films flew high, mounting the pressure on everyone involved, who were already dealing with massive studio pressure that basically dictated everything that happened in the show early on. Scrutiny was so high that even a S.H.I.E.L.D. logo on the side of one of the vehicles being exposed basically made internet headlines. Production on the pilot wrapped about a month later, and soon enough the show had secured its entire first season, which was set to premiere on September 24th, 2013. So let's talk about it. Season 1 focuses mainly on the S.H.I.E.L.D. team's investigation into a group called Centipede, who are responsible for, or at least connected to, most of the threats that they face in each episode. Aside from Coulson, the team is made up of Ward, a field agent who is one of the best at what he does, but isn't exactly great at working with a team. May, who's a former field operative, but has sworn off field work until Coulson convinces her to come on as just the pilot. Fitz and Simmons, a pair of scientists who are as brilliant as they are unprepared to be in the field. And finally, Skye, the only member of the team who's not a field agent at the start of the season, as she's working for this hacktivist, freedom of information type group called the Rising Tide before Coulson recruits her. Centipede is led by this mysterious figure known only as the Clairvoyant, called that because, you'll never guess, he's clairvoyant. Basically, he can just read minds and generally has knowledge beyond normal human capabilities. A lot of the mystery around this season revolves around trying to figure out what his identity is and, to track him down, stop him from hurting more people, all that. A lot of the things that he and the rest of Centipede do seem mostly unconnected at first, but as the season goes on, the pieces gradually start to fall into place more until they form a much bigger picture of what's happening. The second major mystery is, of course, what happened to Coulson. The pilot pretty quickly reveals what he thinks the story is. According to him, his death at the hands of Loki was just a close call, and he only stopped breathing for a few seconds, or more than that, depending on how much he decides to exaggerate. Since then, he's been recovering on the beaches of Tahiti.
It's a magical place.
And now finally has a chance to get back into the field. However, it almost immediately becomes clear that this isn't the case once we see a pretty ominous exchange between Maria Hill and a S.H.I.E.L.D. doctor.
He really doesn't know, does he?
We could never know.
So a lot of Coulson's journey this season revolves around him trying to discover the truth behind his own death. But let's start from the beginning. The pilot follows the team's first mission, where they try to track down a new powered person named Mike Peterson, played by J. August Richards. He's out of work and struggling financially, and he just wants to provide for and protect his son Ace. Centipede, like with many other people, takes advantage of that and essentially manipulates him into participating in one of their experiments. Skye is actually the one who gets to him first, trying to warn him about people like S.H.I.E.L.D., which is why S.H.I.E.L.D. then brings her in to try and convince her to help them before Mike hurts someone else or gets himself killed. So, Centipede gets their name from the first experiment of theirs that we see, this centipede-shaped implant that has a super strength serum, which is what Mike has. However, it is extremely volatile because it has an Iron Man 3 reference in it, and it leads Mike to become increasingly unstable and violent, to the point that, if it continues, he could literally blow up. Skye does agree to help S.H.I.E.L.D. when she realizes that maybe they aren't as evil as she thinks they are, and while they track him down to a train station, Fitzsimmons work on a solution to stop him from blowing up without killing him, which Coulson is adamant about.
We have a couple of hours at most. There's no way that we could possibly...
Don't ever tell me there's no way.
This is a Coulson who has faced death, and he's not willing to put another person's life on the line if there's even the slightest chance that they could be saved, despite how much of a threat that they might be. In a scene that both clearly establishes the kindness and understanding that become primary characteristics for Coulson, as well as showing the new perspective on life that he has after his near death, Coulson talks Mike down with what I think is a really wonderful speech. He lets Mike, someone who just wanted to be a hero in the midst of his unfortunate circumstances, feel listened to and understood.
I've seen giants up close, and that privilege cost me nearly everything. But the good ones, the real deal, they're not heroes because of what they have that we don't. It's what they do with it. You're right, Mike. It matters who you are.
It could, you know. Be a hero.
Counting on it.
In this show, S.H.I.E.L.D. isn't just this shadowy, distant organization who's willing to accept collateral damage for the greater good. Coulson represents a lot more of a human side of it. One that isn't as concerned with rigid protocol and cares about the people that they encounter. Even though Skye could be a direct risk because of her skills, Coulson still gives her a second chance because he sees that her actions, even if they were in direct conflict with S.H.I.E.L.D.'s, were motivated by genuine care and concern for Mike and people like him. And I think this represents the most stark contrast between the side of S.H.I.E.L.D. that Coulson represents, but, from the side that Nick Fury represents. Not that Nick Fury is just cold and heartless, but it is difficult to imagine him doing the kinds of things that Coulson does in this episode. And that sort of dichotomy and contrast will be explored more in the show in the future, but I think it's important to point out how it's set up here. Joss Whedon's involvement in the show would somewhat decline after the pilot, at least in that it was the only episode he would have writing or directing credits on. His work on the next Avengers movie, Age of Ultron, overlapped with production on the first couple of seasons, and at a certain point, just due to sheer pressure from Marvel and how much work the movie required, he would be forced to divert his focus from S.H.I.E.L.D. almost entirely. They didn't actually want me to make it. It's like, Joss, we really wanted you to do Age of Ultron. Instead you created a TV show, you moron. I thought you wanted me to. No, we just wanted you to make a movie. Oh, my bad. It went from being absolutely 100% the driving force and totally hands-on to, that sounds great, Jed. You should do that. So I'm not sure exactly when his big drop-off in involvement was, though I do know that it had to have been before production on season 2 started. From what I can tell, he did help to write several of the early scripts and played a major part in shaping the overall story, along with Jed and Marissa and the other co-showrunners and executive producers, of course. It's just interesting to me how much this show was pitched as the next Joss Whedon show, when that's just, not the narrative at all anymore. I haven't seen any other Whedon shows, so personally, I can't speak to if it falls into any of the, usual Whedon tropes or pitfalls, but I get the impression, at least, that it feels pretty distinct from those, likely because of how heavy Jed and Marissa's involvement was. I will say, though, that Skye is more sexualized early on in the season, particularly in this episode, in this scene, than she is elsewhere in the show, but I can't say for sure if there's a correlation there. I just think that Jed and Marissa deserve a lot of the credit for making the show what it is and what it became, but obviously it was a team effort, like any show is. The pilot released to promising ratings, reaching the highest that a pilot for a drama had in the past 4 years, and it at least held its own against pre-existing, already established shows at the time. Reception from critics, though, was a bit mixed, and those fans that have been waiting with high, possibly too high expectations, were not thrilled. Some of them criticized the humor, the plot, the characters, just overall finding it to be a little bit of a weak start. And unfortunately, the perception of it did not improve as the weeks went on. As more and more episodes came out, the ratings just fell more and more, setting the alarm bells off for everyone, but especially ABC, who had been convinced that a Marvel show would draw in the eyeballs. A lot of pre-existing Marvel fans just weren't showing up week to week, especially as they started to realize that an Avenger wasn't just gonna drop in for a cameo.
Despite the fact that we had sold a show that said not all heroes are super, the audience came every week figuring that the Hulk was going to be on this week, and then, you know, whoever was going to be on next week, and none of that happened.
Which, that's just a really funny expectation to me now, because I always thought it was pretty clear where Joss Whedon stood on that. Like, he was very explicit that he didn't want the emotional impact of Coulson's death in the Avengers to be compromised, which is why the Avengers never find out that he's alive. Like, I just thought it was very clear, yet people still kept wanting that and expecting it. And, like, there were cameos, but there were ones that made sense, you know, like S.H.I.E.L.D. agents like Nick Fury and Maria Hill. Obviously, Coulson was there every week, but if people weren't already Coulson fans, clearly that wasn't enough for them. And at the same time, the show was entirely too connected to the MCU to really appeal to very many people who weren't already fans of it. So it wasn't exactly the best place for a new show to be. On top of this, the showrunners already had to deal with massive amounts of studio pressure and oversight, which I touched on before. It's not surprising, given how high-profile Marvel Studios had become, but it didn't exactly make for the easiest storytelling environment. Like, they were constantly told what they couldn't do or what they had to avoid so it wouldn't conflict with an upcoming Marvel movie or some Marvel property that they couldn't use because they wanted to use that for a movie that was coming up. They even micromanaged the costumes sometimes. The pressure on all sides definitely made the people working on it more defensive of it than they might have been already. Clark Gregg especially felt like a lot of pressure was on his shoulders to make this thing work. He really cared about what they were doing, and, you know, jobs were on the line dependent on the show's success.
I felt, you know, you got 200 people there, 300 who have jobs all of a sudden, and, you know, you want their families to be okay. I took one way too much more than I could have, so much so that, I mean, I think like 3 or 4 episodes in, I would have pressed things. Somebody said, what do you think about the fact that real geeks, real fans have given up on the show already? And I was like, and I spoke before I thought. And I went, well, those aren't real fans. Those aren't real geeks. And I was like, oh, God. And I just, the hate that came at me for that one. But I was really just felt protective of my friends. And I was like, you know, a Marvel fan would give us a little chance to prove what we could do with this show.
Did he lie? Ironically, though, the show's poor viewership might have actually had some benefits. Apparently, at one point, Dan Buckley, who Loeb reported to, went to ABC and said,
if we're going to die, let us die on our own terms. Just no more notes. Just let us make the show that we're going to make.
And it worked, basically. Eventually, studio pressure let up, and the showrunners finally had space to tell the story that they wanted to tell. And the show did have its fans, of course, like, from the beginning. Like, I was one of them. I know a lot of people who were. And I think, like the cast and crew, because of how heavily it was criticized, it led a lot of us to become pretty defensive over it, which can lead to some blind spots over the show's very real flaws.
The defense shields were on, let's say. But yeah, it was definitely a time to just like hear people at like conventions and like other things online, just to be like, well, I don't know about that show. Like, I don't know, like who watches Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D? No one watches that show. And then at least like me and other people would be like, it's me. I'm watching the show. Would you like to know about the show? I can tell you about the show. You know, just to stop that like perception of like any of people supposedly not watching the show that a lot of people are watching.
Even though I might not agree with all the criticisms, I think it's totally valid if you just didn't like the characters or couldn't get invested in the show or something like that. The early episodes strike this balance between a procedural and serialized format, kind of taking on a villain of the week style while also dropping crumbs and elements of the overall plot, and I like it, but that just might not work for everyone. A lot of the early episodes also are pretty light in tone, and so if you just don't like the humor, it makes sense that you might have a hard time getting through them. However, one of the criticisms of the show that I do think is pretty unfair is that this season is slow, or worse, that this first half of it is full of filler. Honestly, in general, I think a lot of our views on filler are pretty skewed and kind of warrants its own video that maybe I'll make it in the future, but basically, I think it's overly demonized. I mean, not everything that we think is filler, and some of the stuff that is, I don't think it's even bad. Like, and viewing it in this really negative way leads to shows that are just overly abbreviated and have super underdeveloped plots and characters, especially the villains are the worst victim of this. Hot take. Filler is good, actually. It's revolutionary. I know. But that isn't even the issue here. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. does not have filler. I would go so far as to say every episode in this season is pretty much essential. Let me prove it to you. Episode 2 establishes the team's normal dynamics on their first mission as a full team, something the pilot didn't have enough space to cover. Also sets up the term 084, an object of unknown origin, something that will become more important later. Episode 3. Ward starts training Skye and she goes into the field for the first time. This is essential to her growth through this season and becoming a more mature agent. Also establishes one of the villains, Ian Quinn, and the gravity-altering element gravitonium, both of which will become important later. Episode 4. The team tracks down one of Coulson's former trainees who is being controlled by centipede eye technology. The connection to Coulson's past is one of our first in-show comparisons between how Coulson was pre-death, staunchly adhering to S.H.I.E.L.D. protocol, versus post-death, being willing to question and go against that protocol for the sake of one person. Episode 5. We dive into Skye's past and what actually brought her to S.H.I.E.L.D. in the first place. Her search for her parents that she never knew, a thread that literally ends up setting up the entire second season. It also introduces another villain, Raina, an important figure in Centipede. Also becomes more important later. Episode 6. This is a Fitz and Simmons-centric episode, which makes it important in and of itself to me, but seriously. It takes these so far more lighthearted and comedic type characters and puts them in a very serious, emotional, intense situation, which spotlights them and their strengths really well as the strength of their friendship.
Because I'm pretty sure that every minute of every day you've been stuck in a lab right beside me. At the academy, at PsyOps, this plane. You've been beside me the whole damn time.
You have to fix this.
I don't know how, Fitz.
And also shows the first inklings that Fitz might actually see Simmons as more than just a friend. Episode 7. Here we get the first real glimpse into Ward's traumatic childhood that he's mostly kept hidden until now. It's also the first major tie-in episode, following the release of Thor: The Dark World and directly connecting to it, at least in small ways. Episode 8. This one strengthens the brotherly bond between Ward and Fitz, and also has this central theme of trusting the system, forcing Coulson to once again question how much he actually does. I think episode 9 is one of the most clever examples of these, at least in the way that it balances tone and also combining a standalone story with important, really interesting plot details. It at first seems like just a kind of lighthearted, kind of spooky, silly little romp, which is fine in and of itself. But through that, the episode is actually able to naturally weave in parts of May's backstory, specifically why she's nicknamed the Cavalry, and through that, takes a shift into a far more serious tone. Basically, Fitz and Simmons conspire to prank Skye like they would a S.H.I.E.L.D. Academy freshman, part of which involves telling her a bogus cavalry story in which May rides into the mission on horseback and takes out basically a whole army. Later, Ward tries to set her straight, but even his story is full of rumors and speculation from likely years of being passed around the agency. Coulson is finally the one who has the thing closest to the truth, because he was actually there in Bahrain when it happened. It wasn't this grand action hero moment, it was messy. It was traumatic. A child died, and it changed May forever. This reveal also then leads into the ending of the episode, where May is able to use this experience to connect with the episode's villain, something that we wouldn't really expect her to be able to do as someone we're often told isn't very good with emotions. And that's all of them, basically. Like, except for the mid-season finale, which I haven't covered yet, those are the episodes that people treat as being so unimportant or irrelevant to the plot, when in reality, it would be very difficult to remove or condense any of that without losing something essential to the rest of the show. I guarantee you that the rest of the season would not have worked as well without that. Like, people praise the later episodes for being a lot more interesting and compelling, and I'm like, sure, yes, I love the later episodes. But for any of that emotional impact to work, and for the mysteries to be interesting, you need to set them up well. I just think that's basic storytelling. For a payoff, you need setup. Like, you understand that, right? I'll get into a lot of the payoff later, but for now, let's just look at the mid-season finale, because even that has a lot of examples of what I'm talking about. So, at the end of the episode, Coulson gets kidnapped by Centipede. Now, if you've seen the movies, you might already care about Coulson enough for this to be a compelling cliffhanger for you. You know, you care about him, you want to see him rescued and know what happens next. But you need time to be able to believe that the other characters care that much too, right? Sky's reaction, especially when there's this big explosion and they all think for a moment that Coulson is dead, is really sold by all of the development that their father-daughter dynamic has had in these early episodes. If you don't get that, you won't buy that the team is becoming like a family. And right there, a huge part of the emotional core of the show just fails. You need to buy that these people care about Coulson enough to risk their lives for him. Like we see them do when they go to huge lengths to get him back after he's kidnapped. The dynamic has to be believable, and you just don't get that if you rush straight to the hard-hitting plot points. Same with the show's mysteries. Here, the episode also reveals that the clairvoyant wants to know what happened after Coulson died, since he can't see that himself. This is an interesting question in and of itself. However, it becomes a lot more compelling and intriguing when we've had all of these episodes of Coulson questioning S.H.I.E.L.D. and reckoning with the truth behind his own death, as well as the festering questions of what Centipede's goals actually are. You can't rush good development. All of the things that the critics seem to love about the show would not have worked without all of the setup that they seem to hate. It just frustrates me when people devalue the really good storytelling that I think is present in the whole show, not just the second half. Or when people gave up on the show because they just weren't patient enough to see it through. If you're one of those people, hi. I don't know why you're watching an hours-long video about a show that you didn't finish, but I'm glad you're here. Like I said, I can understand if there were elements of the show that made it difficult for you to get through it and get invested, but I would just really encourage you to at least finish the first season. I promise the payoff is worth it. If you're a TV critic, though, just go sit in a corner. I don't want to hear from you right now. But fine, I'll talk about the parts of the show I'm sure you actually want to hear about. I mean, I was going to anyways, but just know, if you haven't watched the season all the way through at this point, I'm very disappointed in you. Seriously, don't just listen to me talk about it. Like, there are several episodes that I'll touch on in this part that I think are genuinely incredible TV, and I would really encourage you to experience them yourself, because I just can't do them justice in this video. So if you want to experience those unspoiled, here's your warning. After about a month, the mid-season break wrapped up, and right out of the gate, the show started unraveling some of the season's biggest mysteries. Not only did we hear more about the clairvoyant, but the biggest reveal of the episode was what actually happened to Coulson. After being put in a machine designed to uncover buried memories, Coulson realizes that he did actually die, not for seconds, but for days, before he was eventually brought back to life by some still unknown means. And his pleasant memories of recovering in Tahiti were actually fake, covering up the memory of a horrific operation that was being done to him, during which he begged the doctors to let him die. He is rescued before Centipede can discover what he learned, and then the next episode unravels secrets for a different character, Sky. Coulson and May track down an agent who helped hide her in the foster care system after she was discovered in the aftermath of a bloody rampage and labeled an 084. See, I told you it would be relevant. This then leads to another moment that I really love after Coulson tells Skye what they discovered.
She said no. Her story started here. Her whole life, she thought she wasn't wanted, that she didn't belong, that every family that took her in didn't want her to stay, didn't care. But all that time, it was S.H.I.E.L.D. protecting her, looking after her. That's what she took away from the story. Not the family she'll never have, but the one she's always had.
I just love what this says about Skye and how she looks at things. She's able to twist this life-altering information into something beautiful. She now no longer sees herself as having been unwanted by the foster family she was passed around between. Instead, she now sees herself as having been incredibly cared for by people she didn't even know who were keeping her safe her entire life. It's poetic, and I think it's also just characteristic of her journey throughout this whole season. This is just the kind of groundedness and emotion that I think is really the heart of the show. It's where it really shines, and it wouldn't have worked as well if the show didn't take the time to flesh out the characters. I know I'm kind of belaboring the point here, but it's an important one to make for this season. But while I love pretty much everything in the show so far, I think the following episode is where we see how good the show can really be. It's the first episode to mess with the structure that most of them have in favor of a less linear story. Aboard a train, tracking down Quinn because of his centipede ties, we see the mission through the perspectives of different team members, and each of these build out the story more and more as the mission gradually goes wrong. The initially limited information adds to the mystery as we're left just as in the dark as the rest of the team. While all on the same train, at least at first, they're split up into different pairs, so when they lose contact, there's this unsettling disconnect because they have no way of knowing what's going on with the others. And because we only see things from one main perspective at a time, we get grounded in that isolation, and it does such a good job at increasing the tension throughout the episode. Coulson and Ward initially think the train has just disappeared into thin air, before May's perspective reveals that actually, a new device based off of S.H.I.E.L.D. tech caused the two of them to be frozen in place without realizing it. When they find the train and Simmons, she's panicked and disoriented, and Fitz and Skye are missing. So we see their perspective last, filling in where the train ended up and where they went, to find Quinn. It's kind of like visual puzzle pieces coming together over the course of only 40 minutes, and I am obsessed with it. There are also consistent visual and audio cues to kind of let you know pretty seamlessly when we're starting back from a different perspective, which makes the lack of linearness easier to follow than some stories with a non-linear structure that I've encountered.
Attenzione, signori e signori. As we round the bend, the passengers on the north side of the train can take in the views of the famous Leccini della Veredo. Isn't it a wonder?
The episode culminates in Fitz and Skye making it to Quinn's mansion on their own, and Skye goes in alone to keep him from escaping. A really big step forward in Skye's confidence and bravery from the last time she encountered Quinn. Inside, she discovers that not only is Mike, who blew up in an earlier episode after being forced to sell out Coulson, still alive, but has been turned into a cyborg. And, as comic fans would realize, the show's version of the character Deathlock. She also discovers, though, that Quinn anticipated her arrival, and, under orders from the clairvoyant, shoots her. This was brutal. The show had some of its more serious moments up until now, but nothing on the level of nearly killing a main character. And I think it had added weight because Skye is the youngest member of the team. Throughout the season, we've gotten to see her growing and maturing, only for it to lead to her getting just shot in the gut. She's left to bleed out in the basement, desperately calling for help. Understandably, this scene was a little bit difficult to film for actress Chloe Bennett. I mean, I imagine it was very intense to just be crawling around on the ground, pretending to die for hours and hours, take upon take. Apparently, though, according to a companion book to the season, there was a holiday parade going on nearby while they were filming this, which every once in a while they might be in the middle of a take, there'd be, sounds from it, ho-ho-hos interrupting the filming, and I just think that's a very funny visual that is just gonna forever ruin how I see this scene. Although Skye doesn't actually die here, this moment is kind of the tone shift for the show. No more episodes that have quite the same lighthearted tone that those early ones did. And even when those were more serious, there was still a feeling, I think, that things were going to end up fine. This just kind of felt like a bummer. And remember what I said about it being important to believe that the team becomes like a family? Well, this is one of those moments where that is extremely important. Like, even more than when Coulson got kidnapped. So much of the emotional weight comes in their reactions to our situation. They're devastated, all dealing with it in their own ways, blaming themselves or each other. Like, Simmons tries to just fall into doctor mode, but as soon as she has this, a moment where Skye isn't actively fighting for her life, she just breaks down in Fitz's arms. And then this leads into more unraveling of the show's mysteries as the team is desperate enough to find out how Coulson's life was saved to hopefully save Skye's. Although it's revealed that this is exactly what the clairvoyant wants. So, we and Coulson finally get to see what it was that saved his life and brings Skye back from the brink of death. Bodily fluids from a dead blue alien. Yay! I'm not kidding when I say that this thing haunted my dreams, my nightmares, as an 11-year-old. Apparently it was one of their more expensive special effects jobs, and clearly that paid off. The episode also introduces new characters John Garrett and Antoine Triplett, aka Trip, played by Bill Paxton and BJ Britt respectively, who joined the team on their journey to the guest house where Coulson's resurrection of sorts took place. Garrett was Ward's former superior officer and Tripp's current one, as well as a longtime friend to Coulson. Paxton plays him brilliantly, giving him this immediate likability and charisma, and BJ Britt brings a lot to the screen too, especially with his humor, playing this character that serves kind of as a parallel to Ward, especially as the season continues. Do you see why people love these episodes so much? I mean, no, I'm genuinely asking. I'm trying very hard to explain all of this well, but like I said, it's very difficult to do them justice without just showing you the entire episodes, which would be copyright infringement, so I can't do that. The only part that doesn't work well for me is the 15th episode called Yes Men, which is the only non-S.H.I.E.L.D. character Marvel movie crossover, which is cool, I guess, but it would be a lot cooler if it was in a different episode. Basically, Lady Sif comes to Earth to pursue this rogue Asgardian lady who can control people with her voice. But oh wait, it's only men! All men, yes, because all men have the same weakness. They're all attracted to women, and they just can't resist. This is totally a true thing about all men. This is such good storytelling. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. said, you don't need gay rights because gay people do not exist. I mean, I don't think that was the intention, but it's like they basically say that.
Her powers don't work on women.
No. Men have an inherent weakness we do not share. An inherent weakness we do not share.
I'm not saying you were weak. I'm saying all men are weak.
It's just so fucking stupid. It's so terrible. I hate this episode so much. It sucks. Just stalls the show's momentum anyways. And it's just so weird. Not in a fun way, in a gross way. Ward has sex with the Asgardian lady while under her mind control, which, again, I don't know how the writers intended that to come off, but it does not sit right with me. It's bad. It's so bad. The only interesting thing about the episode is it's kind of the culmination of Coulson's arc of not trusting the system and questioning S.H.I.E.L.D., but it's not nearly a big enough part of the episode to redeem it in my eyes. Oh, and May's a narc. However, it does make a pretty stark contrast to two of the best episodes of the season, if not the entire show. So, complete whiplash, especially if you're watching these back to back. It's kind of jarring. So all of the twists and reveals that I've talked about so far are just dwarfed in comparison to what the show has actually been building up to. Something that would basically change its direction forever. So after their efforts all season, the team finally, definitely, for sure finds the identity of the clairvoyant, a man named Thomas Nash. A name that I later learned is a reference to the guy whose poem kind of led to the term red herring, so I wonder if this is the real clairvoyant. Ward kills him after he threatens Skye, so they can't exactly do anything to confirm his identity beyond what he had the chance to say to them through a computer. And after this, Skye and Coulson realize that they got it wrong. But worse than that, the clairvoyant isn't psychic at all.
The clairvoyant doesn't have abilities. He has security clearance. He's an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.
At the same time, Fitz realizes that May has been secretly reporting to someone, and all of this leads to a standoff between the agents where Coulson believes that May is actually working for the clairvoyant. Before they can reach any resolution, though, the bus is remotely commandeered by high-level S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Victoria Hand. Things across the organization are just thrown into chaos. Garrett is suddenly attacked by S.H.I.E.L.D. drones. Tripp and Simmons, who stayed at the S.H.I.E.L.D. base, the hub, so she could conduct her analysis of Skye's blood, discover that the Academy is under attack, and an encrypted broadcast is clogging up S.H.I.E.L.D. channels. And when Skye decrypts it, the true villain of the season is revealed. All this time, Hydra has been lurking within S.H.I.E.L.D., and now they're finally emerging. Your experience watching this episode would differ pretty strongly depending on if you watched it or the coinciding movie Captain America: The Winter Soldier first. Personally, my family didn't really have time to watch the movie before Tuesday rolled around. It was only like 4 days between them. So this is how I found out about the Hydra twist. Which, I don't think that's how Marvel really wanted people to experience it, but I don't really regret it. It's been a few years since 2014, so I know the reveal seems a bit old hat now, but remember that this was a huge deal at the time, which is why Marvel was being so secretive about it and put so many restrictions on the show, to the point that the S.H.I.E.L.D. writers couldn't even mention Hydra or have any storylines involving duplicitous agents. But beyond just restrictions, this reveal dictated the way the entire season was paced, which, while I don't think that's an issue, does explain why it is the way it is. And it's pretty wild, right? Like, the show just has its whole status quo completely upended 3/4 of the way through. Like, what kind of spy show has its title organization get destroyed midway through its first season? While this might have seemed like a daunting task, Jed, Marissa, and their fellow executive producers welcomed it head on. From the moment we start, we sat down with Kevin Feige and he said, "You know this is all going to go away and you're basically making the agents of nothing, right?" And that was incredibly exciting to everybody involved. It was an opportunity to see it all built up and then all be torn down.
We see what it actually looks like for S.H.I.E.L.D. to crumble in Captain America 2. We see the helicarriers literally barreling through the Triskelion. We see the massive destruction throughout the city. But the benefit of our show is that we get to dive into the emotional toll of that. To build our characters up to a point where they've established a bond and they're working together in a way they've never worked together before, and to strip away the foundation they've dedicated their lives to and trust they've now laid with one another. It's a really fun thing to play.
After the Hydra reveal, the show does not stop with its constant twists and turns. They try to implicate Agent Hand as the clairvoyant, only to muddy the waters when she accuses Coulson of the same thing. But as Garrett and Coulson butt heads over whether or not to kill her, which Garrett is pushing a little too hard for, he slips up, revealing the true identity of the clairvoyant, himself. This is another great scene. The way that Coulson slowly puts the pieces together, and Bill Paxton's acting is great as always. There's this moment where you can see that he's just stopped trying to save face altogether and drops the mask. He slips really naturally into this menacing villain role without it being, like, over the top. And Clark Gregg is doing a great job as Coulson as well, of course, portraying him having to wrestle with the reality of this organization that he's dedicated so much of his life to being a complete lie. Coulson gains the upper hand eventually, though, and the episode ends with showing just how deeply Hydra has infected S.H.I.E.L.D. The traitors are marched out together in this scene, which is silent apart from Bear McCreary's top-tier score, as the betrayal sinks in. Trip has to be held back when he sees Garrett, lashing out at him before he makes eye contact with Ward, who, in contrast, is clearly just confused and trying to make sense of it. This also highlights that while the end of Winter Soldier feels like a victory, it's really only a small one. There's still just immense loss and wreckage for S.H.I.E.L.D. to deal with, and this show takes full advantage of that. And the episode has one last turn left, one that makes the betrayal feel genuinely personal. While transporting Garrett to a secure facility to be imprisoned, Agent Hand makes a choice very similar to the one that Garrett tried to convince Coulson of earlier, that the clairvoyant would be better off being dead. She hands the gun to Ward so he can deal his revenge, but instead of shooting Garrett, he shoots her. No one expected this reveal when it happened. I didn't, no one I know did, and the cast definitely did not. Brett Dalton only found out about it during the production of the previous episode, and when the showrunners called him in, he assumed that they were going to tell him that Ward was going to die.
It's hard for me not to feel like I betrayed them on a really personal level, and they feel betrayed on a personal level too, oh, you jerk.
And if fans had stuck with the show up to that point, they felt the betrayal too. This is the moment that by far relies the most on what's set up by the episodes before it. It's as shocking as it is because of all the moments that we've seen shared between him and the team, the deep relationships that they've formed. He saved Simmons' life. Him and Fitz were like brothers. He and Skye kissed in the same episode. Him and May had sex a couple times. But seriously, he was written to be the archetype of the good-looking, likable leading man, and just like he fooled the team with that persona, he fooled all of us. For the last 5 episodes, the show's operating in this new status quo, as Coulson just tries to pick up the pieces of a broken shield. He's gone from loyal company man, as the writers have described him, to questioning the system upon seeing its cracks, to now seeing that system crumble completely before his eyes. And despite all of that and all of his frustrations with it, he still is one of the only people who believes in S.H.I.E.L.D. and its mission. After leading the remaining members of the team into the middle of nowhere on what seems like a wild goose chase from a likely dead Fury, Coulson gives another absolute banger of a speech. This time, it's kind of reminiscent of that Kevin Feige quote from earlier, if you remember, the one about them becoming the agents of nothing, and directly challenges that idea.
This has to mean something. The world needs us. Hydra is out there. We cannot let them win. We cannot let them define us. Do you understand that? We are not agents of nothing. We are agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and that still carries weight. That has to carry weight after everything we've been through. That carries weight!
Even if his faith has been shaken, he still needs to believe in something. Even though literally almost everyone is telling him to just give up, chronic do-gooder Phil Coulson is, I think, physically incapable of doing that. He literally has Hydra, the government, even some of his own team members against him, yet he still manages to almost single-handedly keep this skeleton of a spy organization alive. I'm just gonna be honest, this video took a lot longer to film than I expected. So we've got a lighting change because I got new lights for Christmas, and I'm figuring out how to use them. So things may get better or worse as we go on. We'll see. And my hair's different now. I dyed it. Just to update you on all the changes. Cool, let's keep going. So this is why Coulson is the heart of S.H.I.E.L.D., both the organization and the show. you need someone who can be kind of a constant throughout all of these ever shifting and changing circumstances. Like, yeah, he does grow and change somewhat through that, but this like core of him pretty much remains the same, of this really compelling and likable leader who is continually willing to give people a chance, and has this really core compassion to him. And I just think that it makes him a lot more interesting than your more cold and distant leaders like Fury, like I talked about before. Like, Fury is very cool. I do like him, but he doesn't have that heart to him. And I think that's one of the things that makes Coulson so likable and also really essential to the show. Put like a 4-season long pin in that. You'll probably forget about it by the time we get there, but it's there. So let's talk about Grant Ward for a second. I love Garrett as a villain, but I think Ward is really the standout antagonist this season, in large part just because of how complex he is. Like, I really like how when he's revealed to be a traitor, his entire personality doesn't just turn on a dime. We don't have to throw out everything that we know about him. Like, yeah, some of the stuff that we've seen has been a lie. His whole clean-cut, nice guy persona is not who he is. However, the connection that he's had with the team and those moments of vulnerability that he's shared with people like Skye, those were real. Those were genuine, as we see when we, finally get this look into his full, character and his background. He really does love Skye, despite how twisted that love might be, and really does care about the team, despite his best efforts not to. However, his loyalty and devotion really to Garrett supersede almost everything. He believes that he owes Garrett his life because Garrett was the one who pulled him out of prison after, he was arrested for burning down his abusive parents' home. And by doing this, Garrett was able to take an opportunity to essentially mold Ward into who he needed him to be.
Ward is who he is partly because of Garrett's conditioning. Because of his devotion to the only person that's ever shown him any kind of compassion, he had a real relationship with Garrett. So Ward's purpose has always been to do things for Garrett. He's still being a good son, regardless of how or what he's doing.
The writers take full opportunity to play with the conflict between his devotion to Garrett and the connection that he still has to the team, most notably when Fitz and Simmons are captured, and Fitz destabilizes the technology that is keeping Garrett alive. Garrett orders Ward to kill them, so he chases them through the bus until they're cornered in a med pod. Fitz tries to appeal to their friendship, the bond they formed, the memories they shared. And as Ward begins to set the pod to drop into the ocean with them inside, the scene is intercut with parallels of another time when Garrett ordered him to cut off a weakness, when he ordered him to kill his hunting dog.
That's not a weakness, is it?
For a moment, it looks like he isn't going to. Instead, he fires his gun into the air to scare the dog off. And we can almost hope that this side of him will win out and he'll let his friends live. Fitz certainly thinks that he might. But that's not what happens.
I know that you care about us, Ward!
You're right. I do. It's a weakness.
He goes through with it, despite their begging, despite Fitz's continued pleas. We see him in the past again, aiming at the dog through a rifle, likely going to kill it anyways. Ultimately, loyalty wins out, and he disposes of his weaknesses. This push and pull between the conflicting sides of Ward just make him so much more interesting than if he was just this black and white, clear-cut villain and traitor. And I think how much the writers lean into that aspect of him really determines how well he works within the show in any given season. Like I said, Garrett is less complex. Like, basically his whole thing is that S.H.I.E.L.D. left him for dead once, which is why he has to have that tech keeping him alive. And so basically he's just in the whole Hydra thing for himself. And the reason that he wanted the serum that saved Coulson and Skye was basically because the tech is failing, and so he wants it to continue to keep himself alive. And basically, most of the things about him are easily summed up like that. However, I think that by no means does that make him a bad or poorly written villain. He's got his motives. They make enough sense for him. And he's just a fun character. Like, Paxton just brings so much to him that I just can't help but love seeing him on screen. Like, he's just so much fun to watch even when he's doing terrible things. Things do get a little wacky when he does finally get the serum. A little unhinged.
I understand it now. I can see its soul. I can see yours too. I am the key to the future of the universe. You hear the dying breath of an old world, General. But a new world is coming. I've tasted it on my tongue. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. Still wildly fun to watch, though. Except maybe when he tears a guy's rib right out of his chest. I wouldn't say that was fun. But yeah, with the major twist of the season already out of the way, these last few episodes mostly just build up to the finale, as there's this kind of push and pull between Garrett's Hydra, which, is also Centipede, and Coulson's S.H.I.E.L.D. I don't want to diminish the quality of these episodes at all. They are really good. We get to see the famed cellist mentioned in the Avengers, the team's reaction towards betrayal, Trip getting to be a real member of the team, and even some more revelations about Coulson's death. These are all solid episodes. They just don't pack as much punch as the ones with the more big moments. But, those ones are some of the best episodes of the show, so I don't think it's really a negative to just not quite be up to that caliber. I just think the biggest consequence of the show being laid out this way is that the finale doesn't really get to feel like a finale. Usually finales are kind of the biggest culmination of all of the events being set up in the show, but because we had that culmination way back in episode 16 to 17, it means that this one doesn't really get to feel like that. Again, don't get me wrong, it is a good episode, but it's just not necessarily what you want or would expect out of a finale. At the same time, though, it does about as effective of a job as it could at wrapping up the still very loose threads left after the Hydra reveal. And because I'm so very biased when it comes to this show, my favorite part is obviously the parts with Fitz and Simmons stuck at the bottom of the ocean. It is a little bit strange, the kind of tone switches between this high energy, high stakes spy mission where they're infiltrating the Hydra base and beating up bad guys, to these a lot more slower and somber emotional scenes between two people who think that they're about to die. However, I don't know, I think it works well enough, and most of what I care about is the stuff in that latter half, and so I don't care. I just want to see my babies. I sound like such a... I sound like I should have been on Tumblr. I'm sorry. Out of all of the characters in the show, I think Fitz and Simmons are definitely the most interesting ones to have in this situation. From the beginning of the show, they're set up as the most naive and least field-ready members of the team. Even Skye, who doesn't become an actual S.H.I.E.L.D. agent until over halfway through the show, seems a little bit more prepared than they are at times. They fill a much lighter comedic relief role in many episodes, but at the same time, in a lot of moments, they demand to be taken seriously.
You certainly have a gorgeous head, don't you? I like men that are about my height but heavier than me.
If we had a monkey, we could get in.
Oh, Fitz!
If we had a small monkey, he could slip through the sensors and disable the fence's power source with his adorable little hands.
Jenna! We're done! No! Jenna! No!
And those moments lead them to grow into far more capable people. And all of that leads them to this moment, where they're forced to face death. And I think these scenes really allow them both to shine as they grapple with that realization in their own ways. In one scene, as they're both discussing death, Simmons starts talking about it in relation to the first law of thermodynamics.
I like to think about the first law of thermodynamics. That no energy in the universe is created and none is destroyed. That means that every bit of energy inside us, every particle, will go on to be a part of something else. Maybe live as a dragonfish, a microbe. Maybe burn in a supernova 10 billion years from now. And every part of us now was once a part of some other thing. A moon, a storm cloud, a mammoth.
A monkey.
A monkey. Thousands of other beautiful things who were just as terrified to die as we are. We gave them new life. Good one, I hope.
This show made me not be able to be normal about the freaking first law of thermodynamics. It's such a true to Simmons way of dealing with and thinking about this terrifying reality. While they're still both clearly afraid of death, they're able to find a little bit of strength in science. They do work out a way to escape the pod eventually, again, highlighting how both brilliant and in sync they are. But because of limited oxygen, only one of them will be able to make it to the surface safely. Fitz begs for her to take the air, and to convince her, finally admits what he's been avoiding.
You're taking it.
Why would you make me do this? You're my best friend in the world!
Yeah, you're more than that, Gemma. But I couldn't find the courage to tell you. So please. Let me show you.
I'm not kidding when I say I basically have this scene memorized. Like I said, I cannot be normal about them. Simmons resists, but she eventually takes it, pulling an unconscious Fitz with her, and they're rescued by another Nick Fury cameo, and Fitz just barely survives. Unfortunately, that isn't actually the main plot, because they still gotta deal with the main villain or whatever. Coulson takes on Garrett, only to find out that he has gone off the wall crazy, rambling about the things that he's seen because of the serum. Oh, and he has super strength now, or whatever. Fury swoops in to help him, and there's a standoff, Fury and Coulson on one side, and Garrett and Mike on the other. Clearly the matchup is pretty lopsided, until Mike realizes that Skye has freed his son, who Hydra was using as leverage. So he turns on Garrett and delivers the killing blow. Technically. Sort of. It doesn't matter. Ward is also taken down in a very cathartic fight in which May just absolutely bodies him, so he gets to be a S.H.I.E.L.D. prisoner now. At the end of the episode, Coulson finally gets a well-deserved opportunity to tear into Fury, since, oh, by the way, Coulson found out that he was actually in charge of the Tahiti Project, the thing that brought him back to life, but resigned after seeing the drug's negative effects. Oh, and he specifically recommended that the project should be ended.
To be clear, I'm recommending the termination of Project Tahiti. Under no circumstances should these procedures or drugs be administered to anyone ever. The cost is far too great. Thank you, sir.
But yeah, Fury, let's violate his direct wishes so you can have your perfect successor. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't make sense for Fury to do, he totally would. But you'd think that Coulson would be, I don't know, extremely pissed about this? And he is, at first. But after Fury explains himself and basically says, oh, Coulson is of Avengers level importance to him, Coulson just drops it? He acts like he's suddenly cool with this blatant violation of his wishes and autonomy. Put a pin in it! I just don't buy that Coulson would be so okay with this so quickly, especially because of his arc throughout the whole season. Honestly, that's my only major gripe with the finale. And at least in this episode, it's pretty minor overall. It's not minor to the rest of the overarching story, but at least in this case it is. But whatever. Coulson ends the season as the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the team reunites at yet another secret base. The episode does do a pretty good job of leaving/setting up new mysteries for the overall season and continuing existing ones. I haven't talked about Raina very much so far, mostly because her role, while it is important, hasn't been huge so far. However, these past couple episodes do start to tease out a connection between her and Skye, which is then emphasized to be very important when we see her talking to this shadowy figure whose hand is dripping with blood, Skye's father. Also showing that the exploration of Skye's past is very much not over. And in the tag, we see Coulson begin to carve the very same symbols that Garrett was carving. You know, when he started losing his mind. So that's a great sign. And that's the season. My definitely very unbiased opinion is that it's amazing. So underrated. Just so underrated. And really, most people that I know or I've heard talk about the show do agree with me that the second half of this first season is really, really good. The problem is not enough people stuck around or came back to the show for that to really matter. The ratings that had dropped early on stayed low, never quite recovering from the hit that they took in the beginning, which sucks because even the critics who complained so much about the beginning of the show praised the second half of it, to the point that reviews beginning with "after a rocky start" became a running joke within the cast and crew. For the showrunners' part, while they were aware of the criticism the show had received, they were still fairly confident that the ups and downs were unavoidable, and maybe even necessary. It's so hard because any first-year show has its growing pains, and any first-year showrunner has their growing pains. A lot of our actors were new to it, and there were some bumps in the road, but most of them were necessary and things we had to go through in order to figure out how to run it better and get the ship moving in the right direction.
I think in the beginning, a lot of our growing pains were born out of learning how to navigate all the different moving parts, because there were many expectations from our audience. I think maybe if I were to look back, I wouldn't have read as much of the criticism as I did, only because we knew going in that we had this grand design that coincided with the films, and we knew that we had to slow play things to lead up to that point.
And in my opinion, it all worked out. The show would not have been what it was if it had been paced differently or relied on constant cameos for views. The showrunners were pretty adamant early on that S.H.I.E.L.D. needed to be able to stand on its own, and I think that was 100% the right choice. And despite the difficulty and some worries about an early cancellation, the show was renewed for a second season, and that would give them the chance to establish more of their own identity apart from the movies that birthed the show. Hi. I filmed this segment like 2 months ago, probably. Back when I was originally, recording everything in much poorer lighting, but also reading my script off of a teleprompter. And I thought that I refilmed almost all of that stuff, but for some reason, I was under the impression that this part was fine. I was like, oh, I don't need to redo it. It'll be totally fine. It was not. It looked terrible. And I'm too much of a perfectionist to leave it be. So I'm redoing it now, but I did not want to go to the effort of setting everything up, like my whole other filming setup up. So you get me just standing and pacing. And also, I discovered that you can record audio with Rock Band microphones. So that's what I'm doing because I can and because it's mobile. Yeah, look at this bad boy. Look at that. It's so funny. It's a great bit, but if the audio sounds terrible, that is why. So, I don't know if you guys have watched these really long YouTube videos that this YouTuber named Quentin Reviews has done on a bunch of like various Nickelodeon shows like iCarly, Victorious, Sam and Cat. I mean, I definitely haven't. Who could possibly have time for that? For literal days worth of content talking about shows that she has never seen. Who would do that? Definitely not me. Not me. Obviously. But in them he's got these like kind of in between talking about the bulk of the show itself, these intermissions where mainly he'll talk about some kind of like, you know, related media, like maybe tie-in merch or video games. So, you know, it's a kind of like fun, interesting way to, you know, break up some of the other stuff in the video and talk about things that aren't necessarily directly like related to it, but again, are somewhat, you know, somewhat related, tie-in. So yeah, I'm stealing that idea. I'm taking it. It's mine now. This is an intermission. You have been tricked. Sorry, Quentin. So what I'm going to be doing for my little intermission, in this video at least, is talking about the first run of S.H.I.E.L.D, I guess, inspired, related comics that came out from 2014 to 2015. So Coulson had already appeared in the Marvel Comics, you know, as a minor character, which, you know, makes sense because he appeared first in the movies. But these comics would both, you know, bring him to the forefront of them and also kind of bring in some of the other members of the team into the world of the comics, specifically Fitz, Simmons, and May. The first run was written by Mark Waid, who was, you know, already known for his work on other series like The Hulk and Daredevil, among a few others. And while the bulk of it came out during season 2, it was announced between both of them. So the characters, you know, from the show's appearances look like they're mostly based on how they look in season 1. And overall, it's fine. Like, I enjoyed it. I can definitely say that I enjoyed it, but it's quite something. One thing to keep in mind is that personally, I really haven't read very many comics. I think the only other ones that I've ever read was one time around Christmas when I was younger. My uncle left out a collection of some of the Flashpoint comics. So, and that was a while ago. So I can't really judge these ones against others. So I'm just kind of bringing my own perspective of, you know, stuff that I do and don't like, but I can't really judge it in this medium because I'm just not very familiar with it. In formatting, it is kind of similar to some of the early episodes. You know, it's mostly just each issue has these mostly self-contained one-off missions that cross over with some other Marvel characters, but there are some overarching threads between them that lead to an at least slightly bigger story. And honestly, I did find it pretty entertaining. Like, I had a fun time with most of it, I have to say. One thing that I really liked about it was that it expanded on this, you know, comic version of Coulson and kind of distinguished him from the live action version that we see, kind of giving him his own fleshed out background and experiences and personality, you know, still being the same kind of character, but, you know, just a new interpretation. In one of the opening scenes, they have a snapshot from his childhood, and then they lead into an early mission that he was on where he was, you know, being held captive and tortured, and basically the way that he withstood that torture was listing off the members of the X-Men in the order that they joined. And I just think that is a pretty brilliant way to both, you know, establish that, you know, this Coulson, he, you know, does still have a lot of that fanboy, nerd aspects to him, but then integrating that into his character in a way that makes it also, you know, while a fun trait, it's also like practical. They make his deep knowledge about all of these superheroes into a pretty fundamental trait of his, and also what makes him a stellar agent. It gives him the unique ability to see ways that he can, you know, plan out a fight, what superheroes to pair together, what potential they have in different, you know, combinations and skill sets. And I think that is a really interesting way to interpret Coulson in this different story. Use what was just kind of, you know, a extra little part of his character and make it pretty fundamental to why he is such a good agent. It's a nearly perfect way to make him stand out and distinguish him from all of these other latex wearing spies. By the way, has anyone ever talked about how just awful the S.H.I.E.L.D. uniforms are in the comics? Like, what the fuck is this? It's so bad. I hate it so much. They all look ridiculous. How is anyone supposed to take them seriously as spies when they're wearing this absolute shit? Who designed this? I hate it. And why hasn't it been changed yet? You know, how well he is characterized does kind of fluctuate between some of the different issues, but overall, I would say that he is one of the main highlights of these comics. Unfortunately, I really can't say the same for the other characters because they get so little characterization. Like, Fitz and Simmons are just kind of the science ones, except Fitz is slightly more annoying, and May is there. She fight real good. And she's real serious. Wow. Simmons does get to have a little bit of extra characterization. In the second issue, she ends up teaming up with Ms. Marvel, and at the end of it, they have a sort of heart-to-heart where they talk about the struggles of leading a double life and the strain it has on family. We get to see how strained Gemma's relationship is with her father, who doesn't know that she's a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, and so she has a bit of bonding with Ms. Marvel over that kind of shared struggle. But that's about all we get for her. I have a very hard time believing that someone who wasn't already an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fan could actually care about these characters at all. They feel like the actual versions of what the critics thought the characters were like in season 1. You know, just having no depth, not being interesting at all, and being able to be pretty easily summed up in like one sentence. Other than that, though, I did find them enjoyable enough. The stories are pretty solid, and I do think that it is a really good concept for a comic series to focus on, you know, having a S.H.I.E.L.D. team just go on one-off missions, because there wasn't really anything else filling that role at the time. And it's also just fun to see the team go on missions with superheroes that we know, like Spider-Man, Scarlet Witch, Doctor Strange, Howard the Duck. No, I changed my mind. I actually hate these for making me read an entire comic starring Howard the Duck. What was the reason? What was the point? Why does the main antagonist want to make him into Fagua? Why is that a plot point? Why does he exist? Do I just hate fun? I don't know. Help me. But seriously, I think one of the main issues here was that it doesn't really seem strong enough to draw in pre-existing comic book fans unless they already had some kind of, you know, particular vested interest in Coulson's story or something. As an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fan, I did have a fun time with them, and it is entertaining to see characters that I love from a show that I love in a different medium. However, none of that is really enough to justify, at least for me, buying an entire 12 comic series just to have a little bit of extra Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. media. And also, as someone who isn't already interested in comics, this is definitely not the type of thing to make me get interested. All that to say, even though they were enjoyable enough for me, I can understand why the run didn't last too long. However, I genuinely wish it had lasted at least a bit longer, if only to prevent the existence of the comic book series that would come next. But that's for the next video. Yeah, I gotta, come on, I can't give you everything. I gotta keep you coming back. There are at least two more videos in the pipeline, baby. Please come back. I just think these are fascinating little artifacts of a time where Marvel had enough faith in this show and its characters to, you know, actually put them and invest in related media. Like, they may not have appeared in the movies, but, you know, they were still part of this connectivity between all of the Marvel properties, you know? They had a presence here. Around the same time that the comics were announced, actually, let me grab it for a sec. This book came out. It's called Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Declassified Season 1, and it's basically kind of like a behind-the-scenes and art book type thing for the first season. This thing has actually been a really great resource for this video because it has a bunch of, cast and crew interviews, concept art, VFX processes, just all sorts of things that are really fascinating to look at and get a glimpse into what the production behind this show is actually like. And look at this thing. It's pretty nice. I mean, I can't open it at the moment because it has this like really cool, slipcase like cover. Here, let me dump it out. But yeah, look. Like it's nice. It's actually nice. All this to say, Marvel was investing in the show in more places than just on TV. Even past the, disappointing first season, they still saw value in it. And that is something that will be important to keep in mind as we get further and further into this whole mess, which we should probably get back to now. So, only 2 weeks off of wrapping post-production on Season 1, the showrunners dove headfirst back into work to begin production on Season 2. Filming began on July 24th, and that same month, there was an announcement that there would be some pretty major new additions to the main cast. Firstly, Bobby Morse, aka Mockingbird, a pretty well-established character from Marvel Comics, who had already crossed over with the S.H.I.E.L.D. comics, and a new agent, Isabel Hartley, who would be played by Lucy Lawless of Xena fame, and both of these were pretty exciting prospects for fans of the show. Cast and crew were pretty tight-lipped on what this season would hold, other than, exploring the mysteries that had already been set up and left open in Season 1. And then, September rolled around again, show premiered, and fans would get one step closer to getting those answers. The second season maintains the momentum created by the end of Season 1 and runs with it. It's a lot more clearly split up into two, major parts of a story than Season 1 was. The first half of the season focuses on S.H.I.E.L.D's continued fight against Hydra, specifically the faction of it that's more science-focused and headed up by Daniel Whitehall, who's played by Reed Diamond. The second half would then move on to focus on the introduction of this new race of superhumans from the comics known as the Inhumans. Most of the rest of the seasons would follow this format, so Season 2 more so serves as kind of a picture of what the rest of the show would look and feel like now that it had really gotten off the ground. At this point, it really feels like they were finding and settling into their own identity as a show that was still very much part of, but still its own thing within the MCU. While Season 1 had to do a lot of the legwork to kind of bridge that gap between the show and the movies that it was sort of spawned out of. This kind of meta story about the show also sort of parallels the story in the show itself, at least as it has to do with Coulson and this new version of S.H.I.E.L.D. under him. He's kind of finding his own identity as well, as both Fury's successor, but also a wholly different director than him. When the story of Season 2 picks up, S.H.I.E.L.D. is still very much in the process of being rebuilt. They've gotten back on their feet somewhat, they've got a new base, new agents, and some resources to work with, but they're nowhere near where the organization was pre-fall. Hydra is still just as much of a threat as they ever were, and on top of that, the government is after them. So Coulson has to contend with all of this while having a fraction of the resources that Fury did. He literally has a toolbox full of secrets and resources from Fury, but he has to manage all of this as one man, which has never really been the kind of leader that he is. So at first, he is a lot more, of that distant, kind of Fury-esque type director, but it doesn't really end up working out for him. Especially since he also has to deal with these ever-increasing impulses to carve the mysterious symbols. Basically, guys got it really rough this season. And he's not the only one. Overall, most of the characters have gone through some pretty big things that change them significantly by the time we see them in Season 2. And things don't get easier as it continues. Skye is no longer just an altruistic hacker. She's now transforming into this toughened agent like May, who is now the one training her. And she kills someone for the first time this season. Like, it's a choice that saves lives, but it's pretty clear that she's not entirely comfortable with what she's becoming. Simmons went from barely being able to lie to allies to being undercover in Hydra and even fooling their top leadership. And Fitzsimmons, as a pair, went from barely ever being apart, and it was a big deal when they were, to now starting out the season separate. And that will become a trend. So Fitz suffered brain damage due to a lack of oxygen when he and Simmons escaped from the bottom of the ocean. And that affects his ability to communicate, use fine motor skills, and just, in general, think as quickly as he used to. And to Fitz, such a big part of who he is, his brain and ability to use it to help the team. So now he has to grapple with all that and where he fits in it now. Worse, team, his friends and family even, don't know how to talk to him anymore or treat him too delicately. And Simmons, the person that he was so close to and used to rely on, is just gone, having left because she didn't think her presence was even helping him. And even when she does get back, there's still that rift. When she comes back after being undercover all that time, she's different. Her look is different and she's a lot more confident. But they've both changed. They're both new versions of themselves, so they're getting to know those new versions as well. Now, I can't really speak to the accuracy of the show's portrayal of someone with, the kind of brain damage that Fitz has, but it does sound like it was important to the writers, and they at least made a big effort to try to represent it well. The writers did a lot of research and talked to a lot of professionals on the subject, and then I did a little bit of my own and worked on it. We just wanted to make it as believable as we could and be respectful to it. It's a real thing that's happened to real people. And to their credit, it does seem like they do a pretty respectful job of it. It doesn't fall into any of the usual traps that I think disability representation does. It's not used as a joke. He's not portrayed as, fundamentally broken because of it. I mean, any supposed value judgments on him are pretty clearly attributed to, how he thinks about himself as, he struggles with, dealing with all of this. His frustrations with himself and the ways that other people misunderstand him. And his arc isn't just about, him, getting better. There is some of that. But it's not to the point of, trying to get him back to a place where he's, how he used to be. He never gets there. Because a lot of it is about him coming into the person that he is now, accepting the ways that, he has changed, and making other people understand that they have to accept him too, because, a lot of their issue is that everyone seems to be trying to treat him or thinking of him as the person that he used to be, when very clearly he's different now. All of them are pretty different now, especially these, 3 youngest members of the team. How the show handles all of that, in the future is a different issue that I will get to a lot further down the line. Probably put another pin in that for the exact same season. Again, at least for season 2, I think the writer's effort does show. As for other characters, well, May isn't all that different, except she's definitely more open now. She's basically Coulson's right-hand woman this season, being burdened with a lot of his biggest secrets, and also the huge responsibility of taking care of him if he goes too far off the deep end, one way or another. But this all mostly leads to big character moments for her later in the season, so we'll get there when we get there. And Trip is here? I'm gonna be completely honest, I forgot to write about him in this part of the script for my first couple drafts, probably. And it's not because I don't love him. He's a great character. He just doesn't have anything to do this season. He hasn't really had much character development since season 1, and I can't even tell you what his arc there was. Going from being a cool, funny, nice guy to a cool, funny, nice guy that the team trusts. There's just not much to talk about with him. You'll see why later. Like I mentioned, there are new characters too. Ironically, Lucy Lawless's Agent Hartley is not one of them. in a bit of a twist, a bit of a rug pull moment, she dies in literally the first episode. Wild. However, her former mercenary friend, Lance Hunter, played by Nick Blood, does end up becoming a part of the main cast, and man, is he a fun one. He's a bit of a wild card, the kind of guy who seems to only care about himself and the few people who are lucky enough to have his loyalty. S.H.I.E.L.D. does end up being on that list, but until that happens, he's a bit of a thorn in Coulson's side. Although Coulson, in his, at this point, near infinite patience, it feels like, does still give him at least a second chance, if not more chances than that. Hunter just also brings a lot of humor to the cast, especially when Bobby is actually introduced, played by Adrienne Palacki, and the two of them just sell the dynamic of a bickering divorced couple who actually does still care about each other so well.
What the hell were you thinking?
What was I thinking? I just saved your life.
You don't think I knew that guy was behind me? This is just you peacocking.
He made you and he was going to kill you. And sweetheart, nobody uses the word peacocking.
Are you even listening to yourself right now? Oh, wait, of course you are. You love the sound of your own voice.
Because it's reasonable. One of us has to be.
This is what makes you so aggravating to be
Hence
with.
not with me anymore. Lucky us.
Yeah, really?
And Bobby is great in her own right. One thing I really appreciate about this show is that they're, strong female characters like May and Bobby. They don't feel one note or like basically the same character but with a different gimmick. The two of them are actually pretty distinct from one another. For example, Bobby is actually very emotionally intelligent, and she uses that to, help her be a spy, to lie, manipulate, and to know when other people are trying to do the same things to her. It's just a lot more interesting than using the same stereotypical female spy template. We love Bobby. Bobby is amazing. And finally, Alfonso Mack Mackenzie, played by Henry Simmons, is the last addition to the main cast, and he is also great. He's a mechanic, very kind and down to earth, and that last bit is honestly a really nice grounding thing to have in a show that can get very wild and literally out of this world. It also helps him connect to Fitz, mostly because he's not trying to treat him like someone he isn't anymore. He just lets Fitz be frustrated, letting him work through whatever the problem is in whatever way he needs to while just being this very calm, grounded presence. He's just very consistently kind. He sticks to his moral code and strong principles, but doesn't do so in a high and mighty, holier-than-thou kind of way. At least in this season. And yeah, that's basically where things are at the beginning of this season. And I think, at least as a setup, this is a lot more of an interesting place to be than where we were at the beginning of season 1. I think it very much feels like its own thing now. Just like the team, it's not just an offshoot of something bigger. This is fully Coulson's S.H.I.E.L.D. now. And while I love season 1, I think this one definitely is more effective in its pacing, or at least in a way that I think will be more appealing for more people. Every episode really distinctly furthers the plot, whether it's the search for basically the season's MacGuffin, the obelisk, Coulson's investigation into the symbols that he's carving, or, the deeper look into Skye's past. All of which really effectively build up to the mid-season finale and essentially set up the rest of the season. In just the first 2 episodes, the obelisk basically ping-pongs between all of the different people trying to find it. We see that Hydra initially had it in the 40s, then Peggy Carter and the SSR took it. It eventually ended up in the US government's hands, where both S.H.I.E.L.D. and Hydra go after it. S.H.I.E.L.D. gets it for 2 minutes, which is how Hartley dies, and then the guy Hydra sends after it gets it, until finally Raina swoops in amidst the chaos and takes it to Skye's father, Cal. After that, Cal eventually brings it to Hydra to, use them as a means to his own ends. The symbols keep popping up in multiple episodes as well. On the back of a painting, on the obelisk itself, and then on bodies, which leads Coulson to have to delve into his past as head of the Tahiti Project to find the patients that are being targeted, as his own impulses are gradually worsening. He does eventually kind of completely go off the rails. He willingly puts himself into the memory machine from season 1 to uncover the patient's identities, and after he does so, he ends up becoming unstable and violent to the point that Skye and Mac have to hold him down. Seeing their director like this clearly shakes some of the trust that Mac has in Coulson's leadership, partly because he already has an understandable wariness of all things alien, but that's an issue for later. Skye tries to lock Coulson up, just until they can finish the investigation, but then Coulson tricks her into the cell instead, insisting that he needs to do it himself. After threatening an innocent man with a gun and nearly killing the killer himself, Coulson's questionable choices actually do pay off. He and the killer find the, missing piece that they've been searching for, and this sparks a realization for Coulson. The symbols are actually a map to an alien city. His alien instability issues seem mostly resolved after this, but the seeds of doubt have already just well and truly been planted. But this discovery sets S.H.I.E.L.D. on a new goal. Find the alien city and destroy it before Hydra can release whatever destructive power that they think is in it. And in the midst of all of this, the show still is seeding out more and more hints that Skye's past might be even less normal than we thought it was. Her father is basically very unstable and murderous due to a botched experiment that was meant to make him stronger, as well as his desperation to find his daughter and put his family back together. Cal is a really interesting character because, yeah, he's not the best guy. Again, literally kills people. But you also kind of feel bad for him. It's so fun to play because in the back of your mind, you know he's a murderer. And then you think about everything he's gone through and you sympathize with him. Because what would you do if your whole family was taken from you? Who would you become? Most of the things that he does, getting the obelisk, eventually bringing it to Whitehall, are all in service of, at least in his mind, helping Skye and, getting her to achieve her destiny, which I guess he thinks will, make her love him / need him more. And then throughout all of this, there's also more and more hints about how Skye is special in some way. Raina talks about how both of them are, destined to receive a gift from the Blue Angels, the Kree we later figure out. Plus, her mom was special. She didn't age. She could touch the obelisk, something that kills most people. Skye's not really having any of it, intent on staying away from the city and not falling into whatever plans her dad might have for her. But in support of the whole destiny thing, circumstances keep pushing her that way anyways. Even though she doesn't go on the mission to the city, she ends up getting kidnapped by Hydra and taken to her dad, who is on the Hydra base set up in that area. And that leads to a less than ideal family reunion. Cal is driven pretty strongly by revenge as well. In the past, Whitehall basically dissected, his wife / Skye's mom, which basically allowed him to take what made her special and keep himself young, like she was able to. So by the mid-season finale, Cal has basically everything in place for him. He's finally in a position to dish out the revenge that he's been stewing on for literal years, and his daughter is in position to, receive the gift that he believes she deserves. And woven into all of these plot threads are really effective arcs for nearly every major character. Obviously, Skye and Coulson's individual, journeys and stories are pretty central to the plot, like I've touched on here, but beyond that, there's a lot of other really compelling character work too. Fitz and Simmons are still navigating what it looks like to no longer be one unit, drifting further apart from each other in the process. Bobby and Hunter are getting closer together again. However, Bobby and Mac have some suspicious stuff going on that Hunter picks up on, which makes trust difficult for him, and May is busy basically carrying the entire team on her back. And Trip is still here. He's vibing, cracking jokes, being an all-around great character. We love you, Trip. Nothing bad will ever happen to you. I haven't talked about Ward much yet, but he's doing stuff too. This is a really interesting season for him. He spends a decent chunk of it as just a S.H.I.E.L.D. prisoner, feeding Skye information about Hydra, and being genuinely helpful in an attempt to regain her trust. However, the really interesting stuff for him comes after he escapes. S.H.I.E.L.D. eventually decides to use him as a bargaining chip to convince his older brother Christian, who is a US senator, to lighten the pursuit of S.H.I.E.L.D. that he's been aggressively campaigning for. This is the very same brother that Ward told Skye about, who essentially forced him to hurt their younger brother. So, understandably, Ward isn't too thrilled about this. But the deal goes through anyways, and he gets transferred over into the government's custody. But the government is extremely stupid and clearly underestimates him, so he escapes almost immediately. While he's on the loose, Ward ends up falling into this not quite the villain, not quite the hero role that, honestly, I think he's the most suited for. He helps S.H.I.E.L.D. from the shadows, giving them gifts like Whitehall's right-hand man, while also pursuing his own revenge, tracking down his brother to ruin his reputation and kill him and their parents. For the first time, he doesn't have anyone that he feels like he needs to follow, so we get to see what he does when his allegiance is really only to himself. And it's interesting to me that helping S.H.I.E.L.D. is actually a part of that. Like Cal, he also joins up with Hydra to use them as a means to his own very similar ends, as in helping Skye, putting him right there in the middle of things as everything is building up to and culminating to this mid-season finale. But basically my point is, there's hardly a second of wasted space here. Like, honestly, I had a really hard time writing this part of the video initially, just because I was struggling to figure out how to get across and condense all of the important stuff just for the video. Like, you can't do it succinctly, there's so much here. It's kind of wild how effective the storytelling and pacing is when, you know, they don't have to completely work around one movie. That's why I say that, especially if you didn't like the first season, this one is a much better trial of if you might like the show as a whole. And, like, for me, I think this is broadcast television absolutely just maximizing its format, using all the space it has super well, super efficiently. And, like, they almost go too far with that. Like, from this season on, they seem to have this idea that they can only have one major villain per, you know, major story arc, which, like, works sometimes, but then other times, like this, it leads to just an extremely abrupt death. Literally, like, Cal and Whitehall are just about to have, like, their whole confrontation, the thing that, like, at least for Cal, the season has been building up to, and then Coulson just comes in and shoots him. And that's where it ends. That's how Whitehall dies. It's hilarious, but it's, like I said, it's just a little abrupt. It just kind of feels like, oh, you know, this arc is coming to an end, so he's just gotta die. So, I mean, I don't hate it. Like, it would probably upset me more if it happened to a more compelling villain. It's just kind of a weird choice. It's a little odd, a little weird. To be clear, I do like Whitehall as a villain. I do not think that every villain has to have, you know, these complicated, deep motivations. Like, you know, sometimes it's great when they do. It's why I like Ward so much, but it's not necessary. I think that a villain can be just as effective if they just fill the role that they were written for well. Whitehall was written to be this, you know, creepy, chilling, mad scientist type, and he does that very well. Like, that's all he needs to do, and he does it. He brainwashes, experiments on, and kills people without regard, most just caring about scientific discovery and power. His catchphrase is literally, "Discovery requires experimentation." And all of that makes him legitimately threatening. And at least for this story, that's all he really needs. But that all just makes the decision to kill him so abruptly feel like, you know, they were just, you know, he'd served his purpose, so they could just dispose of him now. And, I mean, that's exactly how they treated him. Which, like, again, not a great loss to the story. Feels weird, though. They make a similarly weird choice with Ward. Not to kill him, but, you know, they very abruptly end what was a really interesting era for the character. So, after Cal and Ward reveal their hand and turn against Hydra, Ward and Skye end up as Hydra prisoners. Ward escapes, and then goes and frees Skye. But instead of using this tentative alliance until she can escape, Skye just shoots him.
Never turn your back on the enemy. You taught me that.
Okay, we have to pause here because between the period of time where I filmed this and now am editing it, I have changed my opinion. So now I have to do more work. Yay. I blame my brother because a couple months ago we were having a conversation about this scene and I was giving my whole rant for why I don't like the scene, why I think it's dumb that they have Sky shoot him and it doesn't make any sense. And he brought up some really good points. And I sat there for a second and then realized, oh shit, he's right. So here I am, openly admitting that, you know, I think I was wrong about something, and it's okay to change your opinion when you realize that you were wrong. So originally, I always just didn't like this scene, because to me, like, I thought it didn't make any sense that she would shoot him when he's helping her. Like, obviously, yeah, I know that she doesn't like him, but I was like, oh, it would make a lot more sense to just, you know, wait until they're out, or that they can, you know, take him captive again or something like that. Like, you didn't have to shoot him. But really, I think a lot of that opinion was just born out of the things that I do and don't like about Ward's story this season, and how this moment shifts his arc into a gear that I don't like as much. Like I mentioned earlier, I really like the spot that he's in the first half of the season. I just think it's really interesting to see him in this position where, even though, yeah, obviously the team will never forgive him or like him again, I find it really interesting to see him in this place of, in his mind, he still thinks that he is redeemable. He thinks he can still win back the team's and especially Sky's trust. And I just found this position of him helping S.H.I.E.L.D. even though they don't want him to me, I just think that is very narratively interesting. But then the way that his story goes after this moment, I just don't enjoy that nearly as much. I find it to be a lot less interesting. And I think that frustration for me in not finding a character that I found interesting as interesting after this moment, I think negatively affected my opinions on this scene to the point that it was unfair. Because, yeah, it totally makes sense that Sky would do this. I mean, she's not the only one who tries to kill Ward this season. When he is, you know, being handed over to the government, Gemma threatens to kill him if she ever sees him again. And, spoiler alert, she tries to make good on that promise. Like, he has so fundamentally, like, broken the team's trust, hurt them so intensely that they hate him, and it makes sense why they do. I think they are justified fully in the way that they feel about him. And even if that hate doesn't lead to the most, I don't know, pragmatic choice for Sky, with how profoundly hurt she has been by Ward and how much she hates him because of that, it absolutely makes sense that she doesn't want any of his help. He kidnapped her in his extremely misguided and terrible attempt to help her, to reunite her with her father. So obviously she is not going to want his help in escaping. She knows she is perfectly capable of doing that herself, and he's just gonna make things more of a terrible time for her, as he is just repeatedly being so weird in his delusion that she could still love him. So all that to say, It makes total sense why she would shoot him. And I think that my opinion about this scene was very wrong. Okay, now that that's cleared up, we can get back to everything else. So at this point, Hydra has drilled down into the alien city, while S.H.I.E.L.D. has found their own entrance, which they're using to set up explosives and hopefully flood the city. Mac is down there somewhere because the city took over his mind, basically made him into a mindless drone, and Coulson has gone into the Hydra base to rescue Skye. He shoots Whitehall, and Cal is very mad about having his literal life's revenge taken away, so he beats up Coulson, nearly killing him, until Skye finds them and holds him at gunpoint. Basically, she tells him to leave or she'll shoot him, and he does, only after warning her that S.H.I.E.L.D. will be afraid of her once she changes. Only he will understand. And
I love you. I will always love you, Daisy.
Her real name, she realizes, is Daisy. She feels guilty for letting him go, so despite Coulson's protests and her earlier insistence that she would not go down into the alien city, she goes into the alien city to pursue Raina. Coulson follows her, but eventually runs into Mac, who attacks him. When he hears that members of her team are still down there, Trip rushes down into the city to disable the explosives and hopefully help them get out. He finds Skye and Raina in a chamber in the center of the city, which closes after Raina places the obelisk in the middle of it. It does turn out not to be a weapon, however, it has deadly consequences for one of them. It opens, revealing these blue crystals in the center, which send out a mist that hits Skye and Raina and starts encasing them in a rocky crust as Trip watches helplessly. Trying to save Skye, he destroys the remainder of the obelisk, but it explodes and hits him, killing him. Yep. Didn't even get a whole season. Not one. Not less than a full season. And they killed him. He's dead now. Everything's quiet for a moment, then the tremors start. While I don't like how Trip dies, if you couldn't tell, I do really like this scene, and his death at least makes it even more emotionally powerful. Skye's crust starts to crumble, revealing her hand and then her eye, and then all at once it explodes off of her as earthquakes shake the city. Bear McCreary's score really shines in this scene as the music swells as we see everyone holding on for dear life and just trying to survive. May yells for Coulson, Fitz and Simmons cling on to each other as the quakes shake everything around them. Then it gets quiet again, as Skye focuses on Trip, watching what's left of her friend literally crumble away. After this, the tag shows a mysterious man with no eyes in the possession of another glowing diviner, which is the real name for the obelisk, as he tells someone that there's someone new. So I love most of this episode and the way it pays off so much of what has been, built up throughout the season. The payoff of the mystery around the alien city, the, continuing mysteries around Skye and her past, bringing all of these, really strong individual characters and their stories to the forefront, and, there's a lot to like. What I don't like is how they kill Trip. I hate it, actually. I don't like it at all. I understand why it happens functionally, and I think they attempt to justify it in the next episode, because, it adds this real cost and consequences to Coulson's just relentless pursuit of the city, as well as, gives the team a reason to be very skeptical of all of this alien and unfamiliar stuff that they're encountering, something that's pretty key to the second half of the season. But even though I understand all of this reasoning, it still doesn't work for me. And most of that is because it makes him feel disposable, like he's more of a tool than an actual character. Trip is really likable, and he fits on the team very well, but they don't do practically anything to give him much depth. nearly every other character has something to do this season, some sort of major, part in the story or their own whole arc. And he just doesn't. Like, sure, he wasn't in all of season 1, but neither were Bobby, Hunter, or Mac. He's been on the show longer than them, yet they get way more attention from the narrative. So the fact that they don't do much with him, only to kill him in the mid-season finale, just makes it feel like the character wasn't valued very much, which sucks. I don't have problems with shows killing characters. I mean, I think it can be really good at, raising the stakes for a story, for example. But I just don't think that in most stories, it should be done in a way that devalues the character or, shortchanges their story for the sake of other people's stories. I'm looking at you, Secret Invasion. Maria Hill deserved so much better. Something I do find interesting is that apparently Trip wasn't even supposed to be on the show very long. Apparently he was supposed to die, I think, around the end of season 1. So that makes me wonder if that's why he doesn't really have much of a story, because they never planned one for him in the first place. Even if that's the case, though, I don't think that makes the choice any better. On the less frustrating and more exciting side, though, this episode does also come with the reveal of what Sky's real identity is. By this time in the show, it was, pretty clear that, what Sky's real name / origins would be some kind of significant reveal, possibly even connecting to an existing comic book character. Chloe Bennett herself had been speculating almost from the beginning about who it might be.
I thought I was Mantis. I thought I was Miss Marvel. I thought I was She-Hulk. I'd been doing research and reading comic books, and I figured it out about 4 days before they actually pulled me aside and told me. It's really, really exciting. Sky is completely changing, and I'm just trying to give it as much honesty as possible.
So, with the reveal that her first name was Daisy, her father's name was Cal, and that she has these new, earthquake abilities, it was pretty clear that Sky's real identity was none other than comic book character Quake, or Daisy Johnson, and the show would be introducing the Inhumans into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Only a couple months after an Inhuman-centric film was announced to be a part of the MCU's Phase 3.
We are big fans of Secret Warriors. Daisy Johnson is a character that we always liked. We always knew there was potential to evolve Sky into something else. It took a little bit of time, but we were happy when we were able to land on Daisy Johnson and actually have that work in our mythology. But as with everything we do on the show, we pull from the properties and we do our own spin to it. So we are kind of merging a few concepts and storylines. We've spent a season and a half with Sky, we've seen her evolve as a person, we've grown to like her as a person, we've seen her evolve as an agent. And now, finally bringing her to her origin story, I think there's just a lot more emotional weight to it, because you already know her as just Sky. And now she'll have this ability that she may not understand, that she may not want, and plus it's compounded with the fact that it coincides with Trip's death. It's going to be a very complicated journey for her.
Up until this season, most of the material that the show would take from the comics would be pretty minor stuff, usually like a one-off villain or something like that. But with this reveal, this would be the second main character who was adapted from a comic book character, the first being Bobby Morse. And this just kind of added to the feeling that this show was a part of the interconnectedness that all of the Marvel properties had at this time. Just like the movies, it got to introduce and adapt big ideas and characters from the comics and bring them into the universe. Something that would only be further expanded on when, in the second half of the season, when the show would firmly establish the Inhumans within the MCU. At least for now. Not only that, but it got to set up a new show as well. The 40s flashbacks that featured Peggy Carter were a pretty natural jumping off point for the new miniseries, Agent Carter, which aired in S.H.I.E.L.D's mid-season gap and expanded the Marvel offerings that ABC had now. Agent Carter alone changed the look this year of Tuesday nights on ABC, in that we wanted audiences to have 30 hours of Marvel, 22 hours of Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and 8 hours of Marvel's Agent Carter. It was fairly well received. I mean, I liked it. meaning that that look might continue to be changed for the better, at least as Marvel was concerned. The only consequence was that it did stall S.H.I.E.L.D's return for longer than the previous season, but like, if you were tuning in for Agent Carter, you were still getting your Marvel fill every week. And the week after the miniseries wrapped up, S.H.I.E.L.D. was right back on the air and jumped right back into the action. So a lot of the second half of the season mostly deals with the aftermath of the events in the mid-season finale. You know, a lot of stuff about Skye's transformation, how she deals with it, how S.H.I.E.L.D. deals with it, and the path that ends up taking her on throughout the season, as well as just consequences, you know, from Coulson's actions, mainly those being his pursuit of the city that also led Hydra to it. Some of those consequences just being, you know, Skye's transformation, Trip's death, and then how that impacts basically a lot of people's faith in him as a leader. Like the first half of the season, the storytelling is very effective, not just because it's very tight, even though it is, but also just because of how well it plays with its themes, which is something that I'll be talking about a lot in this part of the video. Initially, Skye keeps her powers secret with Fitz's help, and you can't really blame her. Everyone is in full grieving mode because of Trip, and they're dealing with that in their own mostly unhealthy ways. Simmons is probably the one that's most openly affected by it. I mean, her and Trip were close, and at one point she just breaks down and starts blaming herself for his death, you know, because she believes that it's the fault of her lack of caution towards these otherworldly scientific discoveries that, from her perspective, have only caused pain and death. She even muses about how it might be necessary to kill Reyna, who had a far more physical transformation than Skye, and talks about powers and, you know, all of this alien stuff like a plague. While I do think this is pretty horrible language, and it sets up a lot of Skye's own fears about her powers and being different, I don't hate Simmons for it. Like, I think it's important to note that she was one of the people overseeing cleanup of the alien city after it was destroyed. So, just like Skye, she had to see the crumbled remains of her very dear friend.
There must be another...
Trip was in fragments!
I know. Come on. It ends with him. Flooding the alien city may be the first responsible thing I've done to protect the people I care about.
And now she's scared that Skye, another person that she cares deeply about, might have been harmed as well. A lot of her actions this season come from this place of fear and a misguided protectiveness over the people that she holds close, like Skye and Fitz. And it's kind of a very sad twist of irony that those actions actually only end up hurting them more. You know, and I don't think that that makes her a bad person. It just makes her a deeply flawed one, like every other character in this show. People can just get a little too comfortable and intense with hating on characters that are, you know, just realistically imperfect and flawed, especially when they're women. So that's why I say this. Just cut her some slack. It's important to her growth this season. Something we always wanted to do was to show people who come in innocently and naively with the best of intentions, and what happens when they're put through the ringer. How do they grow? How do they get tough? Do they get better? Do they quit? Putting Fitz and Simmons through that in particular, and seeing them split up and coming into their own, has been fantastic. Simmons is getting better at lying. She believes that maybe these enhanced people might be too different and not such a good idea, and Fitz is left wondering, what do you mean different? I'm different. But Simmons and everyone else being in the dark doesn't even last very long. When a wayward Kree reveals that Skye is descended from these humans that some of the Kree experimented on to basically turn them into weapons, she loses control of her powers, and the secret is out. And just like she was afraid of, the very people who were supposed to be her family turn on her. Okay, not completely, and not all of them, but like, in general, they don't handle it well. I specifically hate this one scene where, okay, so the team, like some of the team members are cleaning up after all of this, and they end up getting mad at Fitz for not telling them about Skye, which, fair, I can understand why they feel betrayed, but then they almost immediately go on to just, like, use the most dehumanizing language about her. Like, talk about handling her, that they had a right to know, even though, especially now, they've kind of shown that they didn't do anything to earn that right. And worst of all, Mac just outright says that,
"No, Fitz. We're the ones that need protection from her."
And she hears this. Oh my gosh, Fitz was right. You guys don't deserve to be told shit. And Coulson is only marginally better. So initially, he tries to put Skye on what I think is one of the most ill-conceived S.H.I.E.L.D. ideas ever. The Index. Basically a catalog of powered people. But to do that, he needs to have a psychological evaluation of her. And since they're basically still criminals, the only person they can get to do that is May's ex-husband, Andrew Garner, who is played by Blair Underwood. Oh yeah, she had a husband. And he's pretty cool. He really brings out this side of May that's a lot lighter that we really don't get to see very often. And so that's kind of a really fascinating new dimension of her character that we didn't get before. But after shenanigans ensue, which are partly the fault of her father trying to still get revenge on Coulson for ruining his revenge, she ends up losing control of her powers again, except this time she doesn't end up destroying anything or hurting someone else. She directs them inwards and hurts herself. And by this, it becomes pretty clear that, at least for now, her goal of trying to get back into the field as soon as possible is not realistic or healthy for her. So Andrew recommends that, maybe some time away from S.H.I.E.L.D. is actually in her best interests. Which, smart, probably a good idea. But Coulson takes this recommendation a bit too far and completely isolates her in a remote cabin. Like, she has already gone through a huge life change that's already in and of itself pretty isolating. But then on top of that, now you've completely separated her from her only support system? Great job, Phil! Okay, but the part of this that just really gets me is that he doesn't even ask her. Like, he just takes her there. And it's like, well, cool, this is your new home for however long. Have fun! Really respecting her autonomy there. I'm sure that will never, ever again be an issue for the two of you. Never. Do I even need to say it? I want to make it clear that me criticizing all these things is not me. I'm not criticizing the show's story. Like, I don't think that this is bad, badly written plot points. I'm just criticizing characters themselves and just highlighting how shitty they are to Skye. Like, she deserves so much better. She won't get it, but she deserves so much better. It's just, I think it's important to point out how, honestly, again, it does make sense for the story why, it's probably good, honestly, that this frustrates me so much, because it kind of puts you in the mindset of Skye's own contrast between her struggle with, not feeling like she has a place in S.H.I.E.L.D. anymore, and which kind of pushes her to find a new home that I'll talk about, which I'll get to in it pretty quickly. So it makes that work really well. It's just like, when you really think about it, it's just like, man, they handle this so poorly. It's no wonder that she ends up turning on them. Spoiler alert. And this does end up leading to her being able to connect to people that actually do understand her more. Gordon, who is an Inhuman with teleportation abilities, who earlier teleported Cal and Reyna away to basically keep them and other people safe, he comes to see Skye. He's one of the first people who frames her powers as not something that's just destructive and terrifying, but actually has a potential for beauty. And also tells her that there's a whole community of people who are, just like her, that she would feel welcome and safe among, but, only if she wants to go. She doesn't initially, but it does kind of plant the seeds in her mind that maybe the people who are afraid of her powers are actually wrong. And she ends up taking off the gloves that Simmons made for her, which inhibit her powers. And when she turns on the faucet, she discovers that she is able to, by, manipulating the vibrations, make these really intricate patterns that it's such a simple, small moment, but I just love how it's so simply able to communicate the first time of her getting to witness just something so, delicate and beautiful coming out of something that for her so far has only caused pain. And in general, all of that kind of encompasses one of the main conflicts of this season. Basically, clashing perspectives on how to view superhumans, if they're inherently dangerous, how it changes them, how they should be treated. And that, I think, is a good time to introduce one of the plot points that I have the most complicated feelings about. The real S.H.I.E.L.D. So, like I briefly mentioned, this whole time, Bobby and Mac have been kind of acting somewhat suspicious, and Hunter, who has by now repaired his relationship with Bobby, picks up on that there's, again, something weird going on behind the scenes with them. So when Bobby eventually distances herself from him, he goes and confronts Mac to just figure out what's going on once and for all. And in response, Mac just chokes him out. Very surprising from someone like Mac, who until now has been, a pretty just staunchly nonviolent guy. But, he was panicked and this was his spur of the moment. Brilliant way of covering for them. It's kind of funny. Honestly, you don't really need any other scene to demonstrate how not like, just a, spy, at least in the, stereotypical idea of what Mac is. And honestly, I love that about him. So, when Mac finally brings Hunter to the people that he works for, we and him get to see what Mac and Bobby have been up to this whole time. So, they do in fact work for S.H.I.E.L.D., but they work for the real S.H.I.E.L.D. Basically, they're a different faction of S.H.I.E.L.D. who have been, working and gathering forces in the shadows this whole time, basically working apart from our S.H.I.E.L.D. because they think that it's illegitimate because of Coulson's leadership. A guy named Robert Gonzalez, played by Edward James Olmos, is sort of their primary leader, although theoretically it's run by this board of other agents, including Agent Weaver, who's one of the people we saw in Season 1 helping to run the now-defunct S.H.I.E.L.D. Academy, and these two other guys whose names I cannot be bothered to remember. The bald one's an asshole. That's all you really need to know. So, the core of their issues with Coulson stem from, similar issues that they had with Fury's leadership, It pretty directly continues some of the themes that we saw in Season 1, issues with Fury having, any acceptable amount of collateral damage, expecting people to follow his leadership and decisions unquestioningly, so on and so forth. And kind of to show how valid these issues are, or at least what pushed them to really see them and separate from the rest of S.H.I.E.L.D., we see flashbacks to the fall of S.H.I.E.L.D. when a lot of these agents, Gonzalez, Mac, Bobby, and Hartley, who was also involved in this before her death, were stationed on this very aircraft carrier that they're using now. So originally, Bobby, Hartley, and their whole team were sent to the aircraft carrier just to get what agents they could out, while Bobby stayed back to detonate the ship's server core and sink it. And this would, keep the ship's dangerous cargo from getting into Hydra's hands, but it would also kill countless agents who wouldn't be able to get out in time. And when they realize that they actually might have a fighting chance of taking the ship back against Hydra, even if it's a small one, they start to question if they should actually follow these orders. So they end up all agreeing to completely disregard Fury's orders, and it works. They and many other agents get to live to fight another day because they valued the lives of those agents over what they were told would be for the best.
And we followed Fury's orders. Hundreds of men and women who had devoted their lives to this organization would be dead. And if I had been the man in charge, they'd all be lost.
And this actually mirrors a conversation that Bobby has with Coulson, I believe in the mid-season finale, where he pretty much just straight up tells her that he is not like Fury. To him, there is no acceptable collateral damage. He won't even consider that.
Just want to make sure that we're here to destroy that weapon, not recover it.
Why would we do that?
That's what Fury would do.
I'm not Fury.
With all due respect, sir, this kind of op, Fury would have a number.
A number?
Unacceptable losses.
My number's 0, and for the record, I hate that phrase.
Minimize destruction. You really aren't Fury, are you?
Come on, Bobby. You ought to know me by now. I'd rather use a scalpel than a shotgun.
So, you'd think they do have some basis for, thinking that maybe he's different than Fury. However, they're still skeptical because, despite any differences, he still was handpicked to be Fury's successor. It's understandable that they might distrust someone who has the seal of approval from someone who, if they'd listened to him, they might be dead. And then, alongside all of that, they believe that the alien blood running through Coulson's veins even further impact his ability to lead. And it clearly has affected some of his decisions. Max saw that firsthand. And then, on top of that, even if he's not Fury, he's still continuing some very similar policies of practically no accountability or transparency, to the point that he's working on massive projects behind even his most trusted agents' backs. To be fair, Coulson does have very good reasons to keep things close to the chest. I mean, he's rebuilding a S.H.I.E.L.D. that was destroyed by agents they were supposed to trust. At the same time, you would think that he would at least be able to trust those closest to him, like May, who does eventually start to feel betrayed when she realizes just how much he's been keeping from her. Someone who she thought she was really close with. Clearly, it's a complicated situation, and that's what makes it so interesting at first, It's so ripe for dialogue about these issues, and, they make an actual compelling case for why, hey, our literal main character has some pretty big issues with what he's been doing, the ways that he's been leading. And conceptually, I might even side with the real S.H.I.E.L.D. a little bit. However, things immediately start to fall apart when they actually act on any of their ideas, and you start to realize how much of a clown Gonzalez actually is. An entire circus, even. So, instead of trying to reason with Coulson or do anything remotely diplomatic, they just stage a hostile takeover of the playground. And, the show tries to frame it as them having no other choice. Hunter, who is having none of their bullshit, especially after Gonzalez has a complete non-answer to why they won't just talk to Coulson, he ends up escaping. So they know their whole operation will be blown wide open after he gets to shore. Plus, he interprets Coulson sending Skye to a secure location as stockpiling enhanced people? He just assumes, based on very little information, it's this plus his expensive secret, that Coulson's creating a superhero army? Just absolute buffoonery. Not a single coherent thought was had here. And then also just somehow makes the claim that Coulson is too dangerous to be reasoned with. Where is the danger, Robert? Can I call you Robert? Can I? Okay. Robert. So, I get that, the stuff with the alien city was a bit of a mess. And Trip dying sucks. But no offense to Trip, one death, I just don't think really constitutes a catastrophic event. It's not that, it wasn't. How is your hand being forced? It's just, the reasoning gets so bad that they just automatically lose me here. Any points they had for, any good points they had are so weighed down by just the bullshit. The just absolute stretches in logic, leaps in thought. I hate this man. I'm sorry. I hate him. Because of all this very tight, very sound logic, they blow a hole in the basin and literally take over the whole thing. Guys, you have an aircraft carrier. You don't need an underground base too. Did your mother ever teach you to share? Come on, sharing is caring. You could just ask, hi, maybe can I borrow some of your really fancy tech? Can I just have a conversation with you? But no, we're not going to be reasonable. They talk such a big game about running S.H.I.E.L.D. the right way. And then they do this. Really seems like some Nick Fury shit to me. But what do I know? It's just, to me, I just think their behavior makes them at best incompetent and at worst, hypocrites. I do love this season. I need to make it clear. I like to complain, yes, but I love this season. I just hate this man. He's the worst, and he's so stupid. And then beyond that, as Coulson points out, they pitch themselves as having this collective leadership model. They decide everything together. No one's the leader. But when they're interrogating Coulson, it's just Gonzalez. At the end of the day, who is the one they all look to? It's just Gonzalez.
So now you all operate as what? 5 friendly faces who agree on everything? I don't see the other 4 here talking to me. Just you.
I have no desire to be the director.
And the whole time, the clear and tangible real threat, Hydra, is still out there. But do they do anything about it? No, because Coulson is the problem here. It's totally Coulson, guys. Coulson does escape, though, with May's help, and he ends up meeting up with Hunter to form the most unexpectedly delightful duo in the whole show, not exaggerating, as they try to find Skye and pursue the real threats while having even less resources than before. Another reason I hate Gonzalez is his constant dehumanizing of superhumans, especially Skye.
You want to defend that thing. We can't wear kid gloves around something with powers of that magnitude.
He just continually just talks about her like she's just a weapon rather than a person. And so, of course, they have to bring her in before she hurts someone. In a cabin, in the woods, in the middle of nowhere. And he claims he doesn't want to hurt her, but clearly not everyone is on the same page about that. This bald asshole brings a real gun instead of a nicer and fires at her. Unsurprisingly, she defends herself. And it leads to what I think is supposed to be this emotional scene where, you know, she's realizing the full, like, you know, destruction that she's capable of causing. You know, it follows, like, right after she's, you know, seen there's some beauty in it, but it's, like, the contrast, whatever. I just think it's funny. Because this guy gets a massive splinter in his arm, and he deserves it so much. I wish it was worse. I only feel bad for the trees. We never see him again after this, and the show is better for it. She's still upset, though, and this is when she decides to call for Gordon and, you know, have him take her to the place he was talking about. I think there's some kind of actual explanation for why he knows that she's calling for him, but I think it's a lot funnier to just pretend that he was hiding in the woods the whole time waiting for her. But the whole thing with Gonzalez in a circus just pisses me off because they could have been so much more interesting. Like, again, they have valid points, but it's so difficult to let those points stand on their own when they just consistently do the dumbest things and are just inconsistent with, like, you know, the application of them. You know, it's like, you know, obviously they can be flawed, but people aren't gonna take your criticisms of your main character seriously if they're constantly made by people who say one thing but act in another. They want to run S.H.I.E.L.D. the right way, or, you know, they don't want to be like Fury, or just all this stuff, but they don't do it. But the show never seems to, at least the way that they pose it and the way that writers have talked about it, it really feels like they don't think or realize that these characters are just, again, stupid and kind of hypocritical. Because, like, they talk about Gonzalez, like, you know, in the Declassified book. This was just kind of what made me just lose it when I was writing this. Is they talk about him like, you know, oh, he's kind of this contrast, this foil to Coulson. We wanted to have someone play him who would have just as much weight and people would trust and like. And I'm like, you failed! If you were trying to write someone who people are going to be just as, or at least, you know, could be just as sympathetic to as they are with, you know, Coulson, who's already established. You failed. That's not what this character is. This character, honestly, more so just reinforces the idea that, oh no, Coulson actually, you know, he is a great leader. Coulson is the ideal S.H.I.E.L.D. leader, and he might have some flaws, but, you know, at least he's better. Honestly, I think Bobby is actually a much better representation of their point of view. Probably because of the conversation that she has with Coulson that I talked about. She's a lot more sympathetic to his point of view, and even questions at a certain point whether or not they're going about this in the right way. Mainly for her, at this point, she's just tired of secrets, which I get. I get why May ends up agreeing with her. It's just really hard to take them seriously when Gonzalez's perspective ends up overshadowing almost everyone else's at the real S.H.I.E.L.D., even though he's not supposed to be the director. And Gonzalez just being so frustrating and stupid just makes their criticisms of Coulson hold so much less weight, you know? It feels like they can never just be his, you know, the issues with him can never just be fully questioned because it's got all this other baggage that their freaking everything they do brings to it. So let's just talk about something that I do like now. Basically everything with the Inhumans and Skye. If you don't know, the Inhumans are basically a race of superhumans from the comics. Those generally focus more on the Inhumans from the Inhuman city Adelan and their royal family. S.H.I.E.L.D. does not adapt any of that part of their lore, I guess, because that would be left for the upcoming Inhumans movie, which I'm sure absolutely nothing could possibly go wrong with. Instead, the show establishes its own outcropping of Inhumans, Afterlife, which is basically a safe haven for Inhumans, whether or not they've transformed. Although the show does briefly hint at the existence of Adelan. The point is, though, that this is an important first for the show. You know, like I mentioned before, it's not just introducing a few individual comic book characters, but they're able to take charge of introducing an entire group of superhumans to the MCU and, in effect, setting up an entire movie. You know, this makes it get to be a more active part of the MCU, which is something that'll come up again when we get to this season's major tie-in. For now, though, at Afterlife, we, you know, start to meet more Inhumans, like Lincoln, this very wonderful, sweet man, played by Luke Mitchell, who helps Skye adjust to being there and being an Inhuman. The two of them have a lot of chemistry, so obviously I shipped them immediately.
Take my hand. I know it's so awkward, but you strike me as someone who's generally more curious than afraid. It took a while to get control. When I first got here, I almost burnt the place down, literally. But now, sky's the limit. No pun intended, I guess.
They're so cute. I love them. Like Gordon, he also tries to help her see the beauty in her powers, as well as showing her that, at least to an extent, he understands what she's going through. And this just kind of highlights the contrast between the ways that her fellow Inhumans treat her versus how S.H.I.E.L.D., even her friends at S.H.I.E.L.D., have treated her after her transformation. The Inhumans understand her and treat her like a person, not someone to be afraid of or kept at a distance. Skye's still a bit wary of this new home, understandably her trust issues are back in full swing at this point, but she is able to find a new family or find her way back to one. The woman in charge of Afterlife, Jiaying, played by Deechin Lockman, ends up mentoring Skye, something that is apparently basically unprecedented. And eventually she reveals why she wanted to.
Why do you care if I stay or go, and why are
July
you
2nd. You were born on July 2nd.
She's Skye's mom. She's not dead, and more than that, she seems to be everything that Skye hoped she would be. She's kind, she's strong, and she cares for her people so greatly that she'll basically do anything for him. Just like she would have done anything to get Skye back before she ultimately, decided that she was gone for good. It's a lot more of a beautiful and sweet reunion than the one that she had with her father, mostly because she's actually happy to see Jiaying, unlike Cal. But she does still give him at least the chance for somewhat of a, whole family again, when she reluctantly agrees to a family dinner that goes a lot better than expected. However, Skye's told that she has to keep most of this a secret, because the other Inhumans, knowing that Skye is their leader's daughter, could lead to suspicions of favoritism, something that, for them, has had disastrous consequences in the past. And the story that Jiaying tells to explain this leads to a pretty big character reveal for May, and the answer to one of the biggest questions that we've had since season 1. What happened in Bahrain? This episode is one of the standouts of the season, and one of the few in the show that is almost completely May-centric. We see that before Bahrain, May was a lot happier, had this lightheartedness to her that we only get glimpses of now. And she was also getting ready to start a family with Andrew, which only makes it extra heartbreaking when all of that just goes away. Essentially, May and Coulson were on a welcome wagon operation to bring in an index candidate, a woman with super strength named Eva Belyakov. The operation, though, almost immediately went wrong, and several people, including S.H.I.E.L.D. agents and a young girl, were taken hostage. After more agents get sent in, only to get pretty quickly taken out, May goes in alone, while Coulson distracts the local authorities. What she finds is that Belyakov can seemingly control other people's minds, so she's forced to fight her way through fellow S.H.I.E.L.D. agents in order to get to her. When she does, one of the most brutal fights that we've seen in almost this entire show takes place, and while May is pretty beat up, she wins. Belyakov is dead. However, it's not over. It turns out that she wasn't in control at all. It was her daughter, the young girl, Katya. And backed into a corner and faced with little other choice, May is forced to kill her.
Stop. Just put your hand down and stop. Everything's gonna be all right.
Just please.
And this is the one action that changes her life forever. Jiaying explains that the Belyakovs were in fact Inhumans. Eva stole Terrigen crystals for her daughter so she could go through the mist early, circumventing the usual processes that they have in place for this kind of thing, and causing this entire crisis. I love how much depth this episode gives to May as a character. Characters like this, who generally have this thing of showing very little emotion, can kind of risk becoming, boring and one note, but she's written and played, especially in this episode, in a way that I don't think that really happens. And we also get to have a more in-depth look at, part of the foundation of Coulson and May's strong friendship and why she is so loyal to him, you know? After and during this tragic event, he was one of the main people there helping and supporting her. And that just makes it even more understandable why she's so hurt and betrayed when she discovers how much he's actually been keeping from her. The whole story also kind of illuminates this distance that exists between S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Inhumans. You know, because of events like this, the Inhumans have, you know, from their perspective, very good reason to believe that S.H.I.E.L.D. doesn't handle situations involving superhumans very well. And then Skye is just caught in the middle of all of this. You know, both groups are her family, but they couldn't be further apart. And she's left wondering, who is she more loyal to? Where does she even belong? As the season goes on, the contrast between her two different families just becomes more stark until they inevitably clash. After Lincoln and Mike Peterson are taken captive by Hydra, Skye doesn't really have much other choice than to join back up with S.H.I.E.L.D. to save her new friend. This leads to a surprising reunion of the entire original team, including Ward, whose help Coulson ended up enlisting basically out of desperation when he was on his own. And while they are successful, this means that the existence of the Afterlife Inhumans has been exposed to all of S.H.I.E.L.D. And, of course, they can't all just leave well enough alone. Wanna guess who is the worst culprit of this? Ding, ding, ding! It's Gonzalez!
It's okay. She's in our custody, and we got what we wanted.
What we wanted?
Enhanced people here on the base.
Gonzalez and his people are just convinced that they need to go to Afterlife and index every single one of its residents, you know, stripping them of the privacy and security that they have had for years. They seem unwilling to even consider the idea that, you know, even though these people have lived alongside humans for literal centuries with pretty much only minor incidents, you know, they might not actually be a significant threat. Clearly, these people are capable of self-governance, you know, they've kept each other in check. But, like, no, because Gonzalez is part of this formerly big scary spy organization, obviously he knows better. Like, who gave you the right? I mean, it's very American of him. Admittedly, this isn't, like, completely unprovoked. Gonzalez only, like, really pushes for this after Gordon and Reyna are spotted on board the aircraft carrier, kind of investigating its cargo. The cargo is apparently this ancient monolith that's pretty deeply tied to Inhuman history, and it's dangerous enough that Jiaying is instantly afraid of it when she hears that Reyna saw it in a vision. Oh yeah, she can see the future now. It's a whole thing that I just have not had time to get into. I'm sorry, Reyna, you have been so shortchanged by this video. I don't really have any other choice. Now, the Inhumans don't antagonize them. They just show up, locate the monolith, and leave. But Gonzalez, in his infinite wisdom, takes this as confirmation of just how dangerous they are.
What's our plan of attack?
Who said anything about an attack?
These people are a threat.
We don't know that.
We don't know anything about them.
Except for the fact that they found our base and our aircraft carrier.
They could teleport into this room right now and leave a bomb behind.
We've seen what Skye's capable of. Lincoln could short out our entire system.
I understand your concerns, but the last thing we need is to start a war. We just finished one, for God's sake.
Action needs to be taken, Phil.
You know, he does this really fun thing where he assumes the worst of people and makes tactical decisions based off of those assumptions. But yeah, great man. Great leader. All that stuff that they've been telling us. Totally see it. Unsurprisingly, when S.H.I.E.L.D. just barges onto their land, the Inhumans don't take it very well. Especially Jiaying, who, kills Gonzalez, but, makes it look like he attacked her. Rest in pieces.
Yes, very sad. Anyway.
Oh, and Gordon hijacks a Quinjet to basically make it look like S.H.I.E.L.D. has just staged a full attack. So, yeah, everyone sucks. And it turns out that Jiaying is really willing to do anything to protect her people. Even start a war. Sky is forced to make a choice between her two lives, her two families, and she chooses the Inhumans. She solidifies her choice by fighting May, her former mentor, and she wins, knocking May out. S.H.I.E.L.D. retreats, taking Cal back with him, who Jiaying handed over as, like, kind of a peace offering, but not really. We'll find that out in a sec. And Jiaying recovers disturbingly quickly, because it turns out the way that she heals and stays young is by literally sucking the life out of people. Yeah. Both of Sky's parents are very normal. I love that for her. Her perception of her mother is finally shattered, though, when she walks in on Jiaying killing Reina for standing up to her and basically telling her that Sky is the one who ended up leading them, not Jiaying. While I haven't had much of a chance to talk about her, Reina definitely is a very interesting character this season. She has this whole redemption arc after her transformation. She eventually accepts that she, didn't get the beautiful gift that she was waiting for her entire life, and then discovers that she actually did get a very beautiful and important gift in her ability to, see the future. And with that, she finally finds where she fits, what she's meant to do. While Sky doesn't trust her, Reina does still try to help her, and eventually she does, even though she has to die in the process. But her death allows Sky to actually see the truth about her mother. So Jiaying does the loving mother thing and has her taken prisoner aboard the aircraft carrier that the Inhumans have hijacked, so they can both, secure the monolith and essentially defeat S.H.I.E.L.D., their main obstacle in taking over the world for the Inhumans. Once again, the family that Sky thought she had was a lie. Like Ward, Jiaying is the kind of S.H.I.E.L.D. villain who is interesting partly because you can understand why she's doing what she's doing, even if she takes things to an extreme. To her, S.H.I.E.L.D. is the very real threat, and she has sworn to protect her people from any threats, no matter the cost. And like Cal, she has lost so much, but the way that she's responded to that is by essentially putting everything into leading and protecting her people. You could say that she is somewhat pushed to this point, although that by no means justifies her actions. Like, honestly, she might even be in the right if she just responded by attacking and driving S.H.I.E.L.D. out of Afterlife. But instead, she dials up the aggression to 1,000 and goes for some kind of inhuman supremacy goal instead. This just kind of shows how extreme her mindset has become at this point after everything she's been through. It's kind of like Gonzalez, but in reverse. She assumes that all humans are a threat because some of them have caused them harm in the past. That's why the story of Sky's parents is so compelling to me. It's complicated, it's messy. You feel for these people who have been through so much, but at the same time, see them do these terrible things out of their hurt. And poor Sky is caught in the middle of all of it, seemingly unable to find a family that isn't just utterly broken in some way. But it turns out the parent that actually cares for her is the one who is willing to sacrifice his own wants for her. So Coulson, Mac, and Fitz manage to stop Gordon from using the Terrigen crystals to affect the entire aircraft carrier. But Jiaying still has a whole stockpile that she's planning on leaving with and spreading to the rest of the world, or that's the basic idea. Sky, after being freed by Mac and finding her way through the aircraft carrier, confronts her mother, trying to convince her that this isn't the way to protect their people. But Jiaying is relentless. Now that Sky stands in her way, even she has become the enemy, and she won't let anyone, not even her own daughter, stop her. Sky uses her powers to push the Quinjet holding the crystals off of the aircraft carrier, stopping Jiaying's plan, but the two of them end up in this mutual death embrace. Jiaying is literally sucking the life out of Sky, and Sky is quaking her to death. Both are slowly dying until Cal steps in. While at the S.H.I.E.L.D. base, he initially tried to attack S.H.I.E.L.D., still driven by a desire to protect his family. Coulson appealed to him as a father and convinced him to help them instead, convincing him that Jiaying's fanaticism will only hurt Sky. And when that ends up becoming a reality, Cal takes on the ultimate burden for his daughter. So she doesn't have to kill Jiaying, he does.
You don't have to live with that pain. I will.
What are you doing?
Keeping my promise.
He finally lets go of his idea of a perfect family so he can have at least one moment of being an actually good father, and it's something that's just incredibly tragic but also powerful. He has spent years just wanting to put his family back together, only to have to kill the very woman that he stitched back together all those years ago, because he truly loves their daughter, not as a means to an end, but as a full, strong, and wonderful person. And in the end, he keeps his original promise to Jiaying, to protect Sky. And he gets to have a second chance after this, which is bittersweet, but ultimately I think a really good ending for his character. Him and Sky have a heartfelt goodbye, and the technology from the Tahiti program finally gets an at least somewhat good use. They, give him new memories and a new life, so he can live a life apart from the memory of the horrible things that he's done in his past. But Sky, for her part, has gone from having no parents to having both her parents to now having no parents again. But she seems to have accepted that. She found her answers. She can have peace now, knowing that she is so loved.
I know I'm going away for good. But I was hoping you might come visit. Once in a while.
I will. I promise.
That would be...
Let me guess. The best day ever. You have a lot of those.
No. Just one. July 2nd, 1988.
The finale does a pretty succinct but not rushed job of wrapping up each individual character arc that's been going on throughout the season. While I haven't been able to go into detail on all of it, this season does a pretty good job of giving each character an arc that feels, relatively complete by the end of it. Their growth feels natural, keeping things moving forward while also still allowing them to feel like the same character. This was also the first two-part season finale that the show's done, so they likely just had a little bit more wiggle room to wrap things up than the season 1 finale did. Mac, after almost leaving S.H.I.E.L.D. because of Coulson, decides to stay and is put in charge of alien artifacts because of his caution for them. May takes a much-deserved break from S.H.I.E.L.D. and goes on vacation with Andrew, possibly rekindling their relationship. Bobby and Hunter basically have an entire ordeal over the past couple of episodes, which I haven't had any chance to get into. But basically, Ward and Kara, who is a former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent who was kidnapped and brainwashed by Whitehall until Ward helped her get her memories back, they kidnap and torture Bobby because she was indirectly responsible for Kara being taken by Hydra in the first place. So, to get revenge, they also try to lure Hunter into a trap to kill him, but at the last minute, Bobby throws herself in front of the gun, getting severely injured, and though she does survive, she's kind of left questioning if she even wants to be at S.H.I.E.L.D. in the first place. On their mission to rescue Bobby, May tricks Ward into killing his own girlfriend. So, by the end of the episode, he's just kind of left sulking around, ready to reform Hydra and go on a brand new revenge quest, If you can't help someone else with their revenge, but revenge is really the only thing you've known, then just find something new to get revenge about, obviously. Coulson and Sky, the latter of which finally being back to being a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent, make plans for the possible formation of a covert team of superpowered individuals that S.H.I.E.L.D would lead, kind of hinting at the possibility that the show might have their own version of the Secret Warriors, a team from the comics that Daisy was on. And finally, we get to Fitz and Simmons. Throughout the season, they've managed to both find a way to be their own people while also still, repairing the relationship. They're no longer relying on one another fully, but they still care deeply about one another. And now, the chance for something more between them is once again possible, and they make plans to go on a date.
Me and you, maybe we could eat somewhere else, somewhere nice.
Oh.
But to continue something that becomes yet another trend, they clearly cannot end the season happy. Ever. So, the container for the monolith accidentally gets opened, and after Fitz leaves, fun! This is basically this season's major cliffhanger, something we get basically at the end of almost every season. And just left fans to obsess over and theorize this moment. Like, this is what we were left with. Like, wild. We prefer to leave you something to talk about, to walk away with. The idea of getting Fitz and Simmons, who had been one person, to become two whole people, come back together, agree to go on a date, and then have this happen, felt beautifully poetic and promises some really intriguing stories next season, which is really what it's all about. The season also ends with the reveal that the Terrigen that ended up in the ocean has seeped out and made its way into the food supply. So, I'm sure there will be no consequences from that. And that, my friends, is season 2. While I absolutely love season 1 and will defend it with my whole heart, season 2 really does just step things up a notch. It takes the momentum that the second half of season 1 created and just carries that through the entire thing. And, of course, there are parts that I don't like. You have had the pleasure of hearing me talk about those extensively. But, despite that, it's still amazing. The good very much outweighs the bad. The emotional core of the season is so solid, specifically, with everything going on with S.H.I.E.L.D and her family. Legitimately, I cry pretty much every time I see the scene where Cal kills Jia-Ying, or when him and S.H.I.E.L.D say their final goodbyes. Literally, even when I was going back and looking at those scenes out of context for when I was writing, that part of the script, I started crying. And the general reception with both audiences and critics was a lot more consistently positive for this season as well. The perception of rocky starts was pretty much left in season 1. A lot of people agreed that the show had kind of come into its own finally, being able to stand apart from the movies more and kind of find more of its own footing, its own voice. But even though the general perception of the show had improved, that still wasn't enough to bring it out of the ratings pit that it would basically be in for the rest of its run. Even before season 2 came out, the showrunners were already being asked if they were going to have to adjust it to be the final season. S.H.I.E.L.D would almost constantly have the shadow of possible cancellation hanging over it, because even though it had found its own, small, dedicated fan base, it never found a place within larger audiences like ABC and Disney hoped it would. But by the end of the season, the shadow was pushed back, at least for right now, when the show was renewed for one more season. For the time being, it would persevere. So, while I've talked about most of the relevant stuff for season 2, there is one big thing that I have been saving until now, that major movie tie-in that I've been alluding to a bit. I was going to try and sneak it in partway through that section, but it didn't really fit there, so it gets to go here. It's my video. I can do what I want. like I mentioned before, sometime during the production of Season 1, Joss Whedon was pulled away from work on S.H.I.E.L.D. entirely to just focus on working on the upcoming second Avengers movie, Age of Ultron. This was supposed to be the next big event movie for Marvel. The hype for it was huge, and so were the expectations. And honestly, why wouldn't they be? Given how successful Whedon was with the first one, the follow-up had to be good, right? Right? What could go wrong? Well, Marvel fans should really never ask that question. Because, well, it came out and,
Smaller people? Children. I lost the word.
Sorry.
They sterilize you. You still think you're the only monster on the team?
It didn't exactly live up to expectations. Okay, let me be clear. It's not a terrible movie. It's not terrible. But it's got some issues. Some pretty big ones.
You still think you're the only monster on the team?
And as an Avengers follow-up, it was definitely disappointing. However, disappointment can pretty quickly turn into vitriol in fan communities, and that is, at least from what I saw, definitely what happened. Joss Whedon was no longer just the, Marvel darling. He was now also the guy who made whatever this was. And kind of like what we're seeing with Taika Waititi now, it doesn't really matter how good the stuff you made in the past is. Usually, whatever's most recent is what's gonna stick in people's minds. But while that response couldn't have been fun, it seems pretty likely that Whedon had already decided what his future with Marvel was going to be. Production of Age of Ultron consumed almost all of his time and energy, and by the end of it, it seems like he already came to the conclusion that he was done with superhero movies for now. I made the idiotic mistake of trying to make a great movie, and then I feel like I've been punished for that for the last 2 years. I put a level of pressure on myself that I've never done before. I've been a sketch artist, and now I'm painting. And then also to know that there are not millions, but billions of dollars riding on your artistic decisions. Sometimes you wish you could forget that.
Tiny violins playing. No one's listening, sweetheart.
He was set up with the nearly impossible task of living up to the first Avengers, and he cracked under the pressure. This project just kept getting bigger and bigger instead of smaller like he'd originally intended, and I think that's to blame for at least some of the film's biggest problems. It tries so hard to do so much that it ends up just not doing almost any of it well. Apparently the original cut of it was about 3 hours. Remember when that was a ridiculous length for a superhero movie? Imagine that. I think I want to go back. But while he was already trying to do so much to make his great movie, he also had to consider how it fit into the larger narrative of the MCU. Dropping crumbs for future projects and, connecting to past ones, as was the precedent. It couldn't be its own thing. It couldn't stand on its own because it had to, fit into something much bigger and, larger narrative that it was beholden to. Somebody said, well, that was a great setup for the next thing in one of the test screenings, and I died inside. Marvel executives were like, no, they say that all the time, it's fine. I was like, no, that's the worst thing I could have heard. I want people to come out feeling done. I get the impression that he just felt done with this format and all of the expectations that came with it. And that was it. He walked away from Marvel, the Russo brothers signing on to do the next Avengers movie, and he never came back. And with him, he took any influence that he may have had on the connection between the movies and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But before that connection had been completely severed, it did bring the last big tie-in that we'd see on the show. And that tie-in ended up kind of being two-pronged. First, the episode where the original team infiltrates the Hydra base is almost like a prologue to Age of Ultron. In addition to their main mission, Coulson also steals some information from Hydra mainly the location of Loki's scepter. Kind of appropriate given that that's what killed him. He gives it to Maria Hill, which explains how she knew where to send the Avengers at the beginning of the movie. It's not like a huge revelation, but it is kind of fun to see that, Coulson is still finding ways to help the Avengers even though they think he's dead. The end of the episode also act as kind of like a trailer for the movie. While talking to Jiaying, Rena suddenly gets a vision of a robot attack. Basically the events of, especially like later in the movie.
Consequences are upon us. Men made of metal will tear our cities apart. And the world will be changed forever.
This one is fine. It's a little bit more clunky. Like, it at least does serve some purpose in the narrative. It kind of, at this point, confirms the validity and importance of Rena's powers. But at the same time, it does kind of come off as just a contractually obligated tie-in trailer. So, not bad, not incredible as tie-ins go. And finally, in the following episode, we get to see the most consequential part of this tie-in. Through a flashback, the show finally reveals Coulson's, big secret, the mysterious Theta Protocol that he's been all around the world for, spending immense resources on. The thing that's the major point of conflict between Coulson and the real S.H.I.E.L.D. and, more personally, Coulson and May. That thing? It's a helicarrier. Not one that appears in the show, though. Except, in the flashback. It's in the movie. The one that appears in the movie and saves people. The movie that's a completely different thing from the show and has a completely separate narrative and payoffs. It's a plot device for a different story. This tie-in was pretty cool at the time. I mean, look at that. The events of our show are directly impacting the movie in a pretty big way. But, looking back on it, especially, that's weird, right? This whole thing, Theta Protocol, the helicarrier, this is, a big secret that the show has been building up to through pretty much the entire season. But the show doesn't get the payoff. The payoff is in a completely different story. It's in a movie that can't even acknowledge where the damn thing came from. That's weird. Given the audience, most people watching the show will also see the movie, so it's not like they're missing any vital information. But at the very least, it makes the pacing feel very strange. We have all this build up, but then the only payoff that we get in the show itself is a flashback and a conversation. That's it. And then we gotta wrap up things and move on because, look, we have actual plot to get to.
It's hard to argue with a man who prevented Ultron from killing thousands of people. But there are plenty more battles to be won. And one closer to home that I fear the helicarrier won't solve.
This just makes the reveal in the show feel more like a chore to get through before we, can get to the actual plot relevant stuff. A lot of the narrative around this season is that they were trying to, rely less on the movies and stand on their own more, now that they had a second season. Last year, our mythology, our whole season was built around the Winter Soldier. So the tie-in blew up our show, but also this year we have our own mythology. We are our own story and our own show. It has to exist within our story and tie into their story, which is separate. It's not like our villain is the same villain. Problem with this tie-in is that it makes it so the movies are actually stealing the show's thunder. The thing that was really great about the Winter Soldier tie-in is that the show pretty perfectly balanced both being able to tell all of its own story while still connecting to the story of the movies. While the writers did have some more freedom to write their story around this season's tie-in, it only really ends up harming the cohesiveness of season 2. I don't think the tie-in should have been bigger or anything. Honestly, I think just if it was gonna mess with the flow of the story this much, maybe it should have been lessened. So, it didn't feel like we were just building up to nothing. But it seems like they learned their lesson, because from here on out, pretty much all of the remaining tie-ins are pretty inconsequential on both ends, and honestly, I think that's a good thing. It lets the show continue to tell its story on mostly its own terms, not determined and pushed around by movies with unpredictable release schedules. However, as a consequence, it does also serve to distance the show further from the rest of the MCU. While difficult to coordinate, the tie-ins did make it undeniable at the time that the show was in fact canon, and without big tie-ins, the show risked kind of drifting off into its own corner of Marvel media, something that wasn't helped by Joss Whedon's exit. Admittedly, this is complete speculation, but I imagine that having a familial connection between these two parts of Marvel Entertainment, Marvel Studios and Marvel TV with the Whedon brothers, probably helped a little bit. Like, Joss may not have been working directly on the show at this point, but, he was still in a position to bridge that gap a bit. It's not really possible to know if him being at Marvel longer would have made any difference, but at the very least, he was the first tie to be cut. I do want to acknowledge that I don't think him parting from Marvel is a bad thing. Like, if it's not clear at this point, I am not a Joss Whedon fan. I think it is good that he was limited in the amount of influence that he could have over Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But I think it's important to recognize that his departure is at least a part of the answer to the question that we've been exploring. But it's hardly the complete answer. So, synergy is a word that came up a lot when I was doing research and reading interviews for this video. But something that I also remember hearing a lot at the time when the show was coming out was the idea of it's all connected. This was kind of a slogan for Marvel, especially in these early MCU television years, it's kind of how they marketed a lot of their big tie-ins, like Age of Ultron, trying to make this big deal out of how, these different pieces of media were all, connected in a cohesive universe. It's also the title of one of the installments in the series that they used to do of MCU guidebooks, which covered Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter. Something that I think it's one of many things that's a pretty strong indication that those two shows were, at least at the time, intended to be canon to the MCU. Just make a note of that. And that synergy wasn't just limited to the movie tie-ins, of course. We had that connection with Agent Carter. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was even rumored to get its own spin-off with just Bobby and Hunter. And the show even got to influence the comics. Not only did the show's original characters get to appear in their own comics, like I mentioned, but it even got to influence pre-existing character stories. One comic that I didn't mention was actually probably my favorite of the S.H.I.E.L.D. comics run. It just didn't make sense to talk about it quite yet because I'd only talked about season 1 up to that point. But basically, it brings in the comic version of Daisy Johnson and her father, Calvin Zabo, and integrates her show counterparts in Human Origins into her pre-existing backstory. And around the same time as all of this, Marvel's first streaming show, Daredevil, would come out on Netflix, which was soon followed by an entire slate of Marvel Netflix shows, which would not only be connected to each other, but also acknowledge, at least in passing, a connection to the rest of the MCU. So basically, by 2015, Marvel, and especially Marvel TV, was already boiling over with their coveted synergy. Our challenge last season was, of our 6 characters, 5 of them were new to people, not from the MCU. What's cool this year is that our characters are getting their own comics, they're becoming a part of things, and people care about them. So even if shows like S.H.I.E.L.D. weren't the smash hit that Marvel was hoping for, Marvel TV was still holding relatively strong. Having now fed the mothership, Jeff Loeb could, work Marvel properties into more and more different channels and new media platforms, like different streaming services. Things were looking up, with more and more opportunities coming onto the horizon. But in reality, the cracks just weren't quite visible yet, but would only continue to grow in the years to come. Whew, okay. That was a lot. thank you guys so much for watching this. I just had a lot of fun making this, and I'm so happy that I can, you know, share it with you now and have it out in the world, because this is a show, like I said, that is very important to me, and I love talking about it. So thank you for indulging me, and yeah, please, you know, stick around, like and subscribe or whatever actual YouTubers say, all that. But really just come back for the next one, because that one is going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you for watching.